So, how have you been recently? Been doing much?
Oh yeah, I've been doing the usual things, programming, watching your streams.
Of course, as I am the only streamer that you watch. So let's go to Cube. Shall I refer to you as Stonebrick Studios or Master Stone? Do you have a preference there?
I always found it quite a nice thing you started by calling me Master Stone in your cyubeVR stream, so no one else calls me that, but it works great when you do that, so yeah, feel free to just do that.
Then it shall be Master Stone, and yes, it is a term of endearment that naturally came after enjoying the game, as I did. And would you like me to refer to it as cyubeVR or Cube? I know you're very particular about the name.
I much prefer cyubeVR, yeah.
So I was wondering if you could, from your perspective as the sole creator, could you describe what you feel cyubeVR is as a game, as an experience? Because it may differ subtly from how a user may perceive it. You may have a little bit of special insight there.
Yeah, interesting question, because I actually try to not think too much about that. Because with a game like cyubeVR, it's really a game that the player should be able to shape as much as possible into being the type of game that they want to play, because it's a sandbox game. So yeah, some people can play it as a game where they do the objectives, and from start to finish now. I mean, they didn't exist a few years ago, but now there's this linear list of objectives, and you can just start the game and do the objectives, and then after 10 to 15 hours on average, you're done, have everything unlocked, and you might close the game and never start it again. But in the time, you probably had fun and have enjoyed the beautiful graphics and really cool VR mechanics. But then other people would probably play the game totally differently and see it as a creative tool for building whatever they have in mind. And both these types of playing the game are fine and should be encouraged by the game. So I don't really want to be the game to just be for one specific type of player. I want it to be a game that eventually every gamer can enjoy. Currently, it's a peaceful single-player game, so that limits it a bit. But, eventually it will be a multiplayer and also have enemies to fight and stuff. So the target audience will become larger, and then it will be even more open to how you play the game. And explaining what type of game it is will be quite impossible then, I think.
And eventually, of course, you aim to also turn it into an FPS, MMO, RPG, all in one, correct? Which is coming out next year, I think, that update?
Next year, right, you're right, yeah.
Excellent, good. Yeah, so then it will really appeal to every kind of player.
Yeah.
So to break down what you said into a clarifying sentence, you don't really have any impetus on how or what the experience is. You instead have created the mechanics and the feeling, the atmosphere, and what the player does within the bounds of that is entirely up to them.
Yes, you've said it well. But of course, when I look at how people play the game, then I of course have my opinion on what I find the most interesting, and that's of course seeing these amazing builds that people create in the game and then share screenshots of. So when someone builds like one-to-one scale USS Enterprise or things like that, then I'm always really impressed, and I love seeing that stuff. So when the players show that kind of creativity and skill in building stuff and dedication to spending a lot of time building cool things, then yeah, that's just great.
I can only imagine. Seeing it as another user, it's already very impressive when you consider all of the planning, the effort that went into that. But being the creator itself and being the one who has enabled the player to do this through your own creation, inception, planning and skill, I can imagine that's very gratifying.
Yeah, it is. So every time I see a cool screenshot, I'm really happy about that.
That's lovely. Tell me about the journey of getting Cube onto Steam initially. Why did you start it? How did the process go? And I will ask you questions as you go.
Okay, well, I could probably talk for an hour now. So I started working on cyubeVR at the beginning of 2016. So that's almost 8 years ago now. That is quite a long time ago. It was when everyone was excited about VR coming to PC. It was the time of the HTC Vive dev kit, the HTC Vive Pre it was called back then, time of the Oculus Rift dev kit. And I always was really interested in VR, but when it became close to that quality that, at the beginning when the Oculus Rift Kickstarter campaign was going on, VR was not thought of as something where you really do room scale VR, but more as a replacement for a monitor that you put on your head and then play games with a controller. That was what people thought about as VR in the beginning. And that was interesting, but that never made me think, okay, I want to do something for that. But for me, VR really became interesting when it became clear that soon we will have headsets, consumer VR headsets, where you have 2 motion controllers, you walk around in your room scale VR, and have this really immersive experience with perfect tracking of your hands and your headset. And you can really bring your body into the game and control the whole game with your body. So yeah, that's why in the beginning of 2016, I looked at some of those games that existed back then in VR, some of the early demos, before the consumer headsets were actually released. And I was a bit disappointed with the type of games that there were. I had the feeling that every developer was creating games that kinda looked like mobile games. Simple graphics, because everyone was thinking, yeah, VR, it's quite heavy, need to render 2 images. So they all made these simple graphic style games. For example, Job Simulator is one of those early type of VR games. And it felt like all games had this Job Simulator graphics. And I am someone who really likes high-end graphics. That's really my thing. I want a game to feel like the first time you play Crysis. I want games to have this wow effect of it just looks amazing and I haven't seen something as amazing before. Yeah, and I was totally missing that from VR back then. And that's why in that moment I thought, okay, I am experienced with Unreal Engine programming. I know how to make good games. I should make a VR game. And I should make the type of game that I'm missing. And that's when I started working on cyubeVR.
Why Cube? Why a voxel game?
Yeah, voxel game, that's an interesting question because I think most people who listen now would probably think, well, if you make a voxel game, you made it because you've played a lot of voxel games in the past, like Minecraft, and you liked it, and that's why you want to make a voxel game. But that's not the case for me. I never played many voxel games, but I quite like the overall concept that there's a game and people get into the game and just can be creative and create awesome stuff that the developer never thought of in any way because it's really an open sandbox to do cool things in. And it seems that a lot of people can be very creative with a blocky voxel game who might not otherwise be creative in such ways.
Could you elaborate on that? How?
Well, it seems when you have these very fixed units of stuff to build with, blocks, then you somehow start building with that, like with Legos, and it's not like you need to learn how to paint or how to draw with a pencil or how to do good writing to write a nice book or have other ways how you might be creative. But with blocks, you just place a block and place another block, and I think a lot of people find that relatively easy compared to other types of being creative.
I agree. When you mentioned it that way, when I think about the process of playing a creative game that doesn't use voxels, it definitely feels more overwhelming, even when considering it. But with voxels, every block is the same size and shape, and that adds a kind of simplicity to it, or a kind of elegance to it, perhaps. Yeah.
And then another reason why I wanted to make a voxel game was that it's really, in my opinion, the perfect game to make if you're primarily a programmer. If you're a programmer, I mean, everyone has their skills. I would primarily call myself a very good C++ programmer. Other people might primarily be very good 3D artists or sound designers or game designers or all these other types of things that you do when you make a game. But when you're a solo dev, like I am, of course you have to do everything. So it's quite important that the type of game you make is the type of game that primarily and mostly needs exactly that skill that you are really good in. Otherwise, it will either end up being terrible or you will take the next 10 years learning how to do all these skills that you actually need for the game to become really good at them and then create something that you can actually be happy with. So for me, it was quite clear I should make a game where the programming part is the really important part. And in a voxel game, when you make a voxel game, then you really primarily at first make a voxel engine. So, I mean, I use Unreal Engine, as you probably know, and most people know because cyubeVR clearly does not look like a Unity game, I think. It would be a lot of work to make Unity look like this. It's possible, but a lot of work. So I use Unreal Engine, but internally cyubeVR really has its own voxel engine that I worked on basically the first 1.5 years of working on cyubeVR. I didn't do any gameplay, basically. I worked on a voxel engine because that's what you need when you want to make a good voxel game. A great foundation to implement all these voxel mechanics. Because no game engine is made for a voxel game. Voxel games are very unusual. Unreal Engine is basically an engine for first-person shooters primarily. That's what it was designed for back in the days. And if you make a game that deviates a lot from this basic design of a game where you have people with guns walking around and shoot at each other in rounds and whatever, the more you deviate from that, the harder it becomes. And if you make a voxel game, then you have to do a lot of things yourself that normally in a normal game the game engine would do.
So would you say that you've kind of made your own engine within an engine there?
Yeah.
Do you think it would have been more efficient in the long term to actually make your own engine from scratch, or was Unreal a boon for you?
Oh, Unreal Engine was the perfect choice. I never a second in the last almost 8 years that I'm working on CubeVR now doubted my choice to use Unreal Engine. It was the best engine back then, and it still is the best engine now. And there's always ways in which it could be better, but you always have to think about what would be the alternative be. If I had made my own engine, then, well, in 50 years I might be able to release the first version of CubeVR, but I would never have gotten anything done.
When you first released the game in early access, what was available then, and how did you plan what features to add from then on?
So when CubeVR came out in early access back in 2018, January, it was a voxel game. It was beautiful. It had large infinite worlds that you could explore with really cool word generation that everyone found very impressive. The view distance was quite low, so that's a big difference compared to now. There were a lot less blocks to craft, tools to craft. Some UI stuff looked quite boring compared to now. But overall the game, it was a voxel game that you could play. So if you were a creative type of person who gets a bunch of blocks and can imagine cool things to build, it was already the perfect VR game for you, I would say. It was doing exactly what it was supposed to do in that regard.
And how did you prioritize which mechanics and features to work on next through the years?
Yeah, so in the beginning when I worked on getting the game ready for release, the plan was, okay, I need to make this super beautiful. That's what I want. I need to make it a great game that people who are creative and be creative forever in such games can play forever. And then after release, I got all the feedback from players. And I just listened to the feedback and basically worked on addressing whatever was the most important thing at that moment. And I never really made a long-term plan there, but I just always looked at, okay, what's the stuff that people now at the moment tell me they want the most? Or the bugs they encounter the most often? Or the bugs that I see most often when I watch streams or videos? And address those and make the game better.
So it very much is user-driven.
Yeah. I always, from the beginning, found it super important to tell people, hey, come join the CubeVR Discord. And this decision at the beginning was very important, I think, to create the CubeVR Discord and tell the players to join the Discord and be active and talk to them in chat and have them talk with each other about their experiences in the game and what they want. I think if I hadn't created the Discord, I would probably have stopped working on CubeVR after half a year or something.
Really? Wow.
Because, without the Discord, most players do not engage in Steam forums.
Yeah.
Steam forums are usually super empty and people just...
They tend to attract a more negative side of commentary, I find. The Steam forums too. People will tend to go there usually not to praise or to thank, but just to complain about something.
Yeah, probably, yeah. I've also seen many good ideas in the Steam forums, but I've seen 100 times more good ideas in the Discord. So it's just super important for your motivation as a developer to see people talk about the game and enjoy the game. And that's why it was super important to have the Discord community, have people talk about it, talk to me, talk to them, and see what they do. Post screenshots, post videos.
And is that the primary form of motivation for you, or are there other motivations which keep you going outside of the user feedback at this point?
I would say the user feedback is the primary motivation, yeah. It's just super important. I could not work on a game that's something where, or not just game, a product or a service or whatever, where I just sit all day, program something, and never see what the users actually think about it and what they say, what they want. I need this direct feedback loop, and without this feedback loop, I could not work.
I understand, I think. I think I'm similar in some ways too. So going to the VR aspect of Cube itself now, I've publicly stated in my streams and videos that I'm a fan of a lot of the implementations of the mechanics that you've used, some of which, from my experience, are very unique and what I like to say VR-centric. You mentioned earlier that you really were captivated. I can change the adjective if it's a bit too excessive, that you were very drawn by the physical aspects of VR when motion controllers and tracking were introduced. Why for you is the physical element important or more engaging? Why the physicality?
I think that's what makes VR VR. VR means virtual reality. A big surprise to everyone listening now. But in reality, you don't just look at stuff. You interact with stuff. That's very important in reality. If you couldn't touch anything and couldn't do anything with any objects, then it would be a very boring reality. And reducing VR to just looking through goggles into a world that you cannot interact with naturally isn't really VR for me. That's why I'm also not overly interested in all these VR mods for flat games, because they are still controlled through gamepad or keyboard and mouse then, often, like what Warp X and these tools are doing. And yeah, that's just, I don't really consider that VR. For me, that's quite boring.
So VR is not just the stereoscopy, I think the term is?
Yeah.
Yeah, the stereoscopy, it is the emotion, the physicality for you.
Yeah.
I get the feeling that it's still not been quite decided in the broader community that VR is about the motion controls. Would you agree or disagree with that? I'm not sure how online you are or how well versed you are in the community consensus, but I still get a subtle feeling that VR hasn't quite made its mind up whether it wants to lean into motion fully. And I get this feeling because of how a lot of games are often designed to omit or avoid the use of motion in many ways that assist you to play, that do not need you to actually utilize physicality. Can you understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I think it has changed over time. In the beginning, like 2016, or let's say in the beginning 2013, when the Rift was announced, people thought about VR as this goggle on your head, you look into the world and you play the game with a gamepad. And now, or not now, then in 2016, Valve decided to go get into VR with motion controllers and got the HTC to build the Vive. And that's when people really were impressed by, oh, I have hands, I have controllers. We have kind of totally new interactions in games that were never done before. And then people thought, okay, that is VR. And now, a few years later, the problem is that so many PC VR players feel like there are not enough PC VR games. And that's why they become more interested in mods that try to port flat games into VR, where you often cannot really do this design philosophy of using your hands because the game just isn't designed for it. To have a game work well with motion controllers, really need to have it designed from the ground up for VR. I think that's a super important aspect of good VR games. They need to be designed from the ground up for VR. But when players feel like they don't have enough of such games, then they play the flat games with VR mods instead. And the more people do that, the more they think about VR as not something that uses motion controllers, of course. So I think it has like a down at the beginning, then up in the middle, and now it's going down again, unfortunately.
What is a part of cyubeVR that you are particularly proud of in how you've implemented it?
I would say the first thing that comes to my mind is the near infinite view distance system. I always think that a lot of players are surprised when they see how that works in the game, and it's also code that I'm happy with and just made the game so much better when I implemented it because it doesn't exist in the beginning. So the fact that you walk around in the world, and the more you walk around, the larger your world gets, and you can walk for miles, and as long as your PC is reasonably good, doesn't have to be a super PC. If you have like a 2070, that's completely enough for near infinite view distance because the game automatically calculates LODs for chunks in the distance and shows them as lower detail, and you can see for miles. And if you build a large tower somewhere and you walk away for 2 miles and you look back, you can see your large tower. And I'm not sure how many other voxel games there are where you can do that. That really gives you a sense of I am in this world and I can see the stuff I've done in this world. And it's not the fog of the fog of something that appears after 200 meters.
I don't know how much of a technical accomplishment it is, but it is really impressive because I find with a lot of other games, especially VR games, LOD, the transition of quality of the environment at a distance, is coming back. There is a lot of messiness with seeing the transitions of quality of things, which are not even that far away. I personally despise it. It's one of my pet peeves with gaming, particularly in VR when you're actually in the world and you perceive things in a much deeper and clearer way. I guess what I'm trying to say is, having grown up through the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, I remember that a lot of projects back then, you didn't too often see such jarring transitions of LOD in the distant parts of the environment. And it was more common on PC, but it still seemed cleaner than it is now. And that's what I'm trying to praise with cyubeVR, is that, yes, you will see the transition, but it typically does happen very far away, and it still looks decent and appropriate. It's an impressive achievement, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, thanks. That makes me happy to hear. But yeah, it is still a trade-off, So, of course, if you had a really slow PC, you would need to reduce the settings so that you'd actually see the LOD transitions happening much closer. So, but on a reasonably good PC, you should hopefully be able to set the game to those settings where LODs are not annoying.
Do you feel that there are some other VR-centric interactions or mechanics that you would like to add in the future, or are you fairly happy with what's there now?
I am, of course, very happy with the furnace in the game. I know that's the favorite VR mechanic of most players in the game.
It's such a surprise. It catches you off guard because the rest of the world has a sort of voxel, simplistic presentation. The lighting is beautiful, and then you make this furnace, and it's highly detailed and intricate and has all these nuances to it. Yeah, it really catches you off guard.
Yeah, I think it would be nice if it wouldn't catch you off guard, That means that some of the other stuff earlier in the game is not impressive enough.
Not necessarily. It's no. I really wouldn't say that. I would say that everything has a sort of uniform look and feel to it, and that the furnace is just a standout, but it doesn't mean that the things prior are of not good enough quality. In fact, they're exactly as you would hope and would expect. I think it would probably be a bit jarring if there were more ultra-detailed assets or tools alongside the voxel presentation, alongside the lighting. I think there's a balance there which needs to be struck, where there's a level of consistency needed, and going too high fidelity in too many areas can disrupt.
But I would say that everything in cyubeVR is high fidelity, like the furnace. I'm not quite sure which assets you mean are lower fidelity.
I guess I'm sticking on the idea that the furnace is such a large...
Yeah, it's large.
Yeah, it's a very large and obvious object, and the tools, the pickaxe, the shovel, and blah, 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 they're not low fidelity. They have good detail and shape and so on. They're more understated and subtle. But the furnace just really whoa.
Yeah, with a lot of the smaller assets, of course, you need to hold them 2 centimeters in front of your eyes to actually appreciate all the detail they have and notice, oh wow, the textures do not become blurry because it's all 4K or 8K textures. With the furnace, it's easy because even if you just stand in front of it, you are really close and it's really big and you see, oh wow, it's a lot of detail. So it's just easier to see, yeah.
Yeah, but it isn't just the visual detail of the furnace too. It's the fact that you also added the very impressive and intricate smelting process and how the blocks, how the iron melt, and they don't just transition from one phase to another. They actually smoothly melt and have physics which behave as you expect. And even the fire, I think I said on the last live stream, the fire effect that you have underneath with the coal and grass is probably one of the best looking fire effects that I have seen, maybe in a game. Maybe it's enhanced because I'm there in VR, but it looks pretty damn good. And those elements combined with the obvious size of it, you went above and beyond. And actually, why did you do that? Why not just abstract it? Why did you go to such detail with that process?
Yeah, thank you for nice words. Nice to hear. Yeah, I just love good graphics, That's, I think I said that already. So it's just super important for me that when I add a feature, when I sit down and think about, okay, how could I do this? How would this feature make sense in VR? Okay, I know I want to have iron tools in the game. What should I add for the process of getting these iron tools to be as fun as possible? Well, of course, you need to have a furnace that smelts the iron because, not many choices there, but okay, how should the furnace work? And it's a VR game. You have 2 hands. So you should really have to use your two hands to work on the furnace and assemble it first. It's quite a big recipe. A lot of people always tell me like, oh wow, after I've crafted the furnace, I felt like I've really accomplished something because it's such a big recipe. And then you place it and then you see, oh my god, it's big and it's super detailed. And okay, and now what do I do? And then people think, and okay, 20 iron on top and 20 coal on the bottom, and what I actually need to put it in there myself with my own hands. And yes, you do, because there could be a button that says add 20 iron, add 20 coal, add 20 glass, add 20 whatever. But then what's the point of VR? The same thing would work in a flat game. And whenever I add mechanics to cyubeVR, I always try to think about something where it's completely clear that this mechanic would not work in a flat game. Because if it would work in a flat game, it's probably not a good VR mechanic.
Oh, God. I thank you so much for saying that. It really, thank you. Yeah, I'm with you 1000% there.
Yeah, and I've always thought like that when it came to adding stuff to cyubeVR. Even 7 years ago when I had the log chopping, the thought process was similar, I would say. And the furnace is a bit more recent. It was only added to the game like 4 years ago or 3 years ago or something. And yeah, it was still the same process, just even more, I would say. Because by that point I knew that people actually enjoy these VR-centric interactions with your hands doing stuff. So I was even more sure that it's the right way to do it.
I would assume so also, and the mindset that you approached it with, as you mentioned, I assume as a user would be the default for VR devs when making their game. If we can do this in flat screen in this way, then why would it be in VR to begin with there? But I think you would know my opinion that I feel that a lot of software and devs do not succeed in adopting that mindset for their creations. There's still an enormous amount of abstractions that can be done equally as well in a flat screen game that's implemented in VR. And it's constantly disappointing for me.
Yeah, it is a lot of work to sit down and think about how can I do something in this game in a different way from how I've always seen it done before in all the flat games I've played, because most game developers probably played a lot more flat games than VR games, and there just are not a lot of VR games to play compared to the amount of flat games. So you really need to force yourself to think about VR mechanics, or your first thought will always be, I've seen this mechanic in a game, of course, and it worked like this in a flat game. And now I do it a bit differently in my VR game. But you need to force yourself to not think about how you've seen a mechanic in a flat game, but instead erase all that knowledge about how stuff works in other games and think about from zero again, this is a VR game, I'm making a VR game, I need to think about a VR mechanic.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the time, like a lot of devs are always very time constrained. If you're not a solo dev who can just work on stuff forever, if you have an investor behind you, a publisher that wants you to release at that date, you cannot just sit down and think for a week about, how could this be done? Let me implement it like this. And doesn't feel great. Okay, then let me do it differently. And then a month later, maybe redo it again because you had a better idea. With that process, you will probably not hit that target date that you have to hit for your game, if there is one. So you really need to have this flexibility and freedom to experiment. And yeah, many devs do not have that for financial reasons.
I understand the financial part. I struggle to empathize with the other parts, though, when you mention that they need to force themselves to think, how should this be in VR, or think about that. For me, that's a reflective and natural thought. If I'm presented with a tool or a method that clearly changes the paradigm, then I don't think, how can I use that in the same way as before? I immediately feel excited to explore the brand new ways that this tool can have us do things and interact and so on. So I do struggle to empathize there, but I can appreciate where you're coming from. And financially, I absolutely get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, I just assume that if you are a professional dev or someone reasonably experienced in that world, then by default, you would be quite excited to have a completely new paradigm and way to take steps forward in the medium, and that it shouldn't really be a struggle for you to want to explore the new ways outside of the financial and economical aspects, of course. If you are an artist and you've been making your art with these certain tools for a long time, and then all of a sudden you have access to a new set of tools that can enable you to do things in a whole new way, that you would naturally be excited and intrigued to want to explore that. And that's how I feel. But yeah.
Yeah, there are many devs like that, I think.
No, I'm sure. Don't see them too much in the VR space, though, I think. Or at least, I don't know. I can only speak from a very naive and user-sided perspective. So I'm holding my tongue more than I actually feel. If I were being completely unempathetic and sharp and honest, I would just say, no, it's your job to be creative and do these things. That they often fail to properly think, how should this be done in VR? And all those considerations that you mentioned, it's just unacceptable to me. if I were being completely blunt, but I try to employ more empathy there. If I were a dev, I would make sure to kick myself up the arse all the time, that I do not become too complacent in that way.
Yeah, that maybe you would be able to do it, but you also really need to have in mind that coming up with a completely new mechanic in a game that was never done before by other devs is actually hard. It's not hard to have an idea for something that sounds good in your head, but it's really hard to implement the idea in a way that players will tell you this is actually really fun.
What I feel about that is, I don't think when it comes to creating things, we should ever approach it in a way where we want to do something completely new, but rather that the new idea or mechanic that hasn't been done before would eventually emerge from a step-by-step iterative process of wanting to see how you can push things a little bit with these new tools. And then the more that you explore that, those explorations come together into something that equals an innovation or something new. And I feel that that's a usual part of learning and exploring in a creative sense. So yeah, if I were a dev, I wouldn't, or if I were trying to adopt the mindset, I wouldn't look at a new paradigm and think, right, I'm going to make something that's completely new and no other dev has done before. I think that would be way too egocentric and too much of a burden. But instead, I would slowly explore with things that make sense for that and push it a little bit. And through that, the process emerges. If you get where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and pushing it a little bit is what many VR devs are doing, right? Yeah, it's easy to push something a little bit.
I don't know. I haven't seen. Well, have you played The Burst recently?
No.
That's pushing the physicality, where the arm swinging is mandatory to activate sprint and stuff, and that's good. It should have come about 5 or 6 years ago, but better late than never, I suppose. Anyway, I'm getting off track. I want to circle back. So you mentioned that your thought process in making the Forge and that you have 2 controllers, and so of course you want to put
the furnace.
Oh, excuse me. Yes, the furnace. Thank you for the correction. You mentioned that you were thinking about, you should physically put the blocks into the top of the furnace, and so on, and what works for VR. But you could have stopped there. You could have just made it so we physically put the blocks up top, and then we close the lid, and an invisible process happens where you wait a certain time, and then suddenly the smelted iron comes out. But you went one step further and made it so that the blocks themselves would gradually heat up, and then melt, and then actually physically start falling down to represent their new size. Why did you do that? Why not just abstract and make things much easier for yourself, where we just close the door, wait some time, and then the liquid comes out?
Well, that would have been boring, right?
Yes, it would have been, but it's a hell of a lot more work for you.
That's true. It did take quite a while to add, yeah. But being the perfectionist I am, if I have in my mind that there is a really cool way how I could do something, then I want to do it the really cool way. And again, I really like good graphics. And watching a closed lid, seeing a percentage go up, is not as good graphics as watching the iron actually melt and seeing it glow, seeing it become liquid. It just looks so much more impressive. And yeah, there's just my love for good graphics that works really well together with my love for good VR mechanics, I think. Because a good mechanic, after which you can enjoy good graphics, that just works ideally together, right? If you see the fruits of your work of putting in the coal and the iron and lighting it up with your hands, with the flintstones, that's always something that I see impresses people. That you do not click a button to start the furnace, but hey, you have to grab a flintstone in the left hand, grab a flintstone in the right hand, and actually start the fire by hitting the dry grass with sparks. And it just makes so much sense to do it like that in VR. It feels great, it looks great, so why not do it like that when you have the option and when you can take the time to do it like that? So for me, it was the choice to do it like that.
When you set out to implement it in that way, did you already have a rough idea of how you might do it, or were you proficient enough with your skills that you could conceive a general idea before you started, or was it something brand new that you had to learn in order to get it working?
Do you mean that regarding the programming or the idea of the mechanic?
The programming side of it.
The programming, there I was very sure in my ability to do whatever I want. I never really need to doubt myself much there.
Because if you didn't have the certainty of your skill, then perhaps you would have opted for the abstracted version then.
That's true, yeah. If something is totally unthinkable for me to implement, then of course I would not even try it, because, yeah, what's the point if I don't know how to do it? But as someone who's used Unreal Engine for so many years, I'm quite confident in being able to implement everything I want in this engine and making it look cool. It just takes time. Time is the big thing.
Yes, time is always the thing. Time is something we are obsessed with as a society. Time. All the time. My favorite interaction is chopping the logs and how granular it is. It will respond almost precisely to how you angle the axe. It's my favorite interaction, and I wanted to ask you, why did you decide to add that mechanic in this way, and how difficult was it to implement from a programming perspective?
The why is easy because it just makes perfect sense to do wood chopping like that in VR. I don't remember how long I've thought about how I want to do it, because that was like 7 years ago by now. So I don't remember everything. Yeah, since I started working on cyubeVR almost 8 years ago, and that's one of the first mechanics I added into the game. That was probably around 7 years ago, yeah. So I don't think that it took me a long time to think about, chopping logs with super precise control that chop them exactly where you hit them would make sense. I think that was quite obvious to me. So the implementation then is, of course, the harder part than thinking about it. But I had luck there that Unreal Engine actually has a feature that just works quite well for that. So I did not have to manually program the code that actually splits up a mesh into 2 pieces. I just had to integrate it well into my game as a mechanic that's actually fun and works and doesn't make everything flying into the distance because the physics are weird or because the performance is bad or all the other things that a game could do badly with an actually good mechanic in theory.
Normally, such mechanics are not so granular and free, and it tends to be in a lot of games, both flat screen and VR, that anything that is breakable will have a sort of predetermined or predefined way that it can break, with a few exceptions. And I always assumed it's because to make something truly dynamic and granular that is breakable and changeable would be incredibly performance intensive, and I'm sure that it can be in some ways, but your implementation, that does not seem to be the case. Is there some special trick that either the engine has utilized or that you have used your talents to have that function in a performant way?
Well, the special trick with regards to performance is often multi-threading. You need to do stuff on a background thread and not on the main game thread that defines what your frame rate is. So cyubeVR always was from the beginning designed that ideally everything that the game does, all code I write, should be super multi-threaded. If you have a CPU with 16 cores, then the game should be able to put that to 100% if you want to really stress your CPU and make the game maximally beautiful. And most games are not designed that way because it just adds a lot of complexity to the code, makes it harder to maintain, takes longer to write the code if you want to design it from the start to actually multi-thread the code well.
I have noticed that, actually. Again, only as a layman, but I monitor my stats in an OCD way when I'm playing, and I have noticed a lot of games will only use the 1 or 2 threads, despite having many cores and threads available. So would you say that it's still a trend with devs that they do not utilize multi-threading or actually taking advantage of the numerous cores in CPUs, and that's because they just can't be bothered?
It's a trend that has changed, I would say. So 10 years ago, most devs didn't care. Or like 20 years ago, everyone did everything on the main thread. Because many CPUs simply only had a few threads. So there was not much to gain by splitting up all your work with way more complex codes onto 4 or 8 threads when most people just have a CPU that has 1 thread. But then as CPUs became better and better and had more and more cores and threads, game developers lagged behind quite a lot in implementing that into their design philosophy of their code. Because they were used to doing it one way and engines were designed for doing it one way. And if you have all this legacy code and legacy knowledge, it's very hard to change that suddenly or within a few years. So that's why only now games and game engines really start to go all in on using many cores, I would say.
Did you design the art for Cube? Did you draw all of the textures yourself?
No, I am really primarily a programmer, and I would say I'm quite good with using Photoshop and doing 2D image editing, but I'm not good with drawing a texture or 3D modeling something. That's not my thing. So with textures, the good thing is like you don't need to do that. There are a million textures game devs can buy on the internet. You go to whatever website sells textures and get beautiful 8K textures on there. So you just need to edit them and make sure they fit the game well, which I can do. So that's much easier than doing everything yourself. And especially because cyubeVR is a game that should be about these beautiful graphics. I want all the textures to be 8K resolution or at least 4K. Everything should be super high detail, and you do not sit down and draw an 8K texture. So the concept of drawing the art works for some mobile games with hand-drawn art that can look very good if you like that art style. But since I never really was interested in that art style much, and I much prefer the realistic art style, I can only really use textures that are actually photographs of real stuff. So the grass texture is a photograph of someone who photographed grass. And I could go outside and try to photograph grass, but why do it when 1,000 people have done it before and are really skilled at that and sell their photographed grass?
The question that I ask every dev I've interviewed so far, why solo? Why do it yourself? Why not join a team or get regular help?
Because there's no choice, I think. No one chooses to be a solo dev, I think, or at least no one who starts making a game chooses to be a solo dev. It's just out of necessity that you want to make a game. You do not have the money to pay a team of 10 people a salary for 2 or 3 years to finish a game. So either you make the game yourself or you never make a game. So, and then the obvious choice is to be a solo dev.
If you had the option, would you prefer to have a little team?
Yes, I think so. I always hope that at some point I would make a great game that everyone loves and sees it's awesome and sells well, and at some point then I might have the money to hire a few more people and not be a solo dev anymore, but so far that unfortunately hasn't happened, so that's why I'm still a solo dev.
Did you expect to be working on Cube for as many years as you presently have?
I don't quite know. Probably not, because it's really hard to expect to work on something for 8 years. Like, when can you actually say what you will do in 8 years from now? But looking back, I also don't know what would have been the alternative. So, I mean, after I released the game and after it had players that were actually interested in it and having it develop further, it was, of course, clear that I would work on it and try to make it the perfect game that I envision. So, if I had really thought about it, then of course I would have hoped that I would still work on it 8 years later. And I would have been optimistic that I still work on it 8 years later, but I would not have been sure.
Do you burn out?
I don't think so, but I also don't know how to really know that.
So, whenever you consider the idea of working on Cube for a prolonged period of time, or a continued period of time, and when you think about the other mechanics that you think should be implemented, does it fill you with a sense of excitement and anticipation, or does it feel like a bit of a burden in some ways? Like, oh God, I'm still doing this.
Primarily it fills me with excitement, of course, because I want to have all these amazing things into the game and see how it actually looks like then. Especially when thinking about cool graphics features. Like, you know, at the moment CubeVR is still using Unreal Engine 4, and there's Unreal Engine 5 with some really cool new graphics features. And I look forward a lot to updating CubeVR to Unreal Engine 5 and making use of all these amazing graphics features to make the game even more beautiful, because that's what always really excites me a lot. But of course there are also some features that stuff where I don't feel super excited about adding, that I just have to do. Because I know, okay, this is needed, it's not super fun to add, but it will make the game much better, and even if no player will ever see it, because it might be something in the background, just in the code that has to be done. But yeah, so I don't think everything has to be super exciting, but as long as on average it's exciting, it's good.
Could you give me an example of one thing that you just mentioned that you're not so looking forward to having to add, but needs to be added?
Yeah, so sometimes there are bugs in the game or in the engine. Some weird bug that something does not look correct, some shadows flicker, or weird stuff that happens where you have no idea why it happens. And then, well, of course, you would like to actually work on the cool, exciting features you have in mind and not sit down and dig through the engine code for 2 days to try to find how to fix this annoying bug. So that's stuff that sometimes is a bit annoying.
When it comes to bugs which are introduced in an unexpected way that you say you have to dig through the engine code for days to find, I assume that various sections of the game are packaged into isolated chunks of code that will interact occasionally. So when it comes to bugs that appear unexpectedly, I'm not actually sure what I'm trying to ask. The more that I say this question, the more that I'm saying to myself internally, you have no idea what you're talking about, don't even bother. Is the game code split up into isolated sections? Is it not a practice to split up different sections of the game into their own isolated chunks to avoid unexpected things happening in another chunk when you modify another chunk, if you get me?
I would say it's not usually done like that, in that way that you describe. I mean, all codes at some point has to interact in some way with each other. There are things like different modules of code, and the engine, for example, like Unreal Engine, has a lot of different modules that are somewhat self-contained. But the game is designed to usually be one module that interacts with all the modules from the engine. Of course, if you make like a really big AAA game, then you might decide to split up your game into different modules. But at least as a solo dev, there's not much incentive to do so. It just makes stuff more complicated.
Is it mostly programming that you do then? Is that pretty much your life these days?
Well, no, it's more than programming, because at the moment I'm quite busy with bringing cyubeVR to PSVR 2, and there's quite a bit of bureaucratic stuff to bring the game to PlayStation, and so it's not just programming.
Tell me about that process, if you can. How is it trying to get it onto PSVR 2? Are there many complications?
Yeah, good question. Complications, well, complications is a difficult word, right? If something is expected to be difficult in some way, then is it a complication? Or is it just normal?
I suppose, yes. I guess it depends on one's expectations. So if we take a more emotional route, how has it been feeling-wise and process-wise for you to deal with this? Has it been better than expected, worse than you may have expected?
I would say it has been pretty much exactly like I expected, because I expected it to be difficult. So I just had good expectations, I would say.
Is dealing with corporations interesting for you?
No. I'm a programmer by heart, and I always have been, and that's what I really enjoy doing. Writing code, looking at my code, being happy with my code that I wrote, and being happy that it just works, and works fast, and in a way that everyone can be happy with. And having to do other stuff that's not programming is usually by far not as fun as the programming part.
So has programming always been your thing since you were a young age?
Yes, I would say so.
How old were you when you first started?
I think probably around 12, 13.
That's actually older than I expected based upon how I've spoken to you before and your overall skill. I assumed you would have started at a much earlier age.
I think it's very hard to motivate much younger people to do programming. I'm not sure if I could have been motivated to really do programming. I mean, there's a difference between programming and just learning how to use a Windows PC, how to build your own PC, how to install Windows, how to make Windows work well and install a million weird softwares and hack your PC in funny ways. I mean, that's the stuff that you probably find more fun at a young age. And then when you really want to create your own stuff, then you get into programming. And yeah, that's how it was for me. Usually, you need to do a few projects before the project you do ends up being really good. So usually the first game someone makes is not a good game.
Really? I'm so surprised to hear that. The Steam storefront would say differently in many ways. It almost feels like you're getting a lot of the first-time releases on there, particularly for VR.
Yeah, that's probably true, because it's easy to get stuff on Steam. It's very easy.
Yes, probably much easier than I know. I've never looked into that side of things. UE5, you're transferring to UE5. When do you plan on doing this?
At some point next year, after the PSVR 2 release. At the moment, I'm focused on getting the game running perfectly on PSVR 2. And I think it would not be a great idea to do the switch to UE5 before that, because who knows how long that would delay the PSVR 2 release with some unexpected problems that might occur from an engine change. But yeah, after the PSVR 2 release, I plan to relatively quickly get to UE5. And I think it will be quite nice.
Will the PSVR 2 release remain on UE4 and the PC
No.
for UE5? No.
Once it's battle tested on PC.
And what excites you about UE5's possibilities for CubeVR?
Well, the main thing that UE5 is doing is the complete paradigm shift with regards to LODs, Nanite. Normally, games made with UE5 will no longer have any visible LOD transitions. So if you despise LODs, then of course UE5 will be something you will absolutely love once it's more common in VR games, because you will not see LODs anymore. In the beginning, UE5 Nanite didn't actually support VR. So for a long time, there was no point for me in switching to UE5 because, 5.0 and 5.1, I think 2, just did not support Nanite in VR. It just was something for flat games. I think 5.2 was the version that added Nanite VR support, or 5.3, I don't quite remember at the moment. So Nanite is quite exciting, with the big caveat that Nanite does not work for procedurally generated meshes. You can only use Nanite for meshes that are generated in the editor, in the Unreal Engine editor. So the voxel world in CubeVR cannot actually be Nanite. That has to stay on the system it's now. Regular meshes with manual LODs. But everything else in the game, like trees and grass and a super detailed furnace and tools and everything you see, except for the animals, because animated meshes also do not support Nanite yet, but that will come reasonably soon, I am quite sure. But especially foliage. Foliage is the big thing, because if you would look at where CubeVR is spending your performance at the moment, a lot of it is trees and grass. Because trees and grass, foliage generally is super expensive to render, because it's a lot of small vertices and triangles, a lot of overlapping stuff. It's not one big triangle that's rendered and hiding anything behind. It's a lot of triangles that you can see through. That means one pixel might have a lot of different foliage triangles on it. So one pixel is a lot more expensive to render than a pixel that just shows a block where nothing is behind, because it's a block. And Nanite will make foliage so much nicer to work with. At the moment you just have to set the LODs quite conservatively so that many more triangles are rendered than would normally need to be rendered if you had a perfect relationship of one triangle per pixel. And that's what Nanite is doing, trying to get this perfect ratio of one pixel should be one triangle, because if one pixel is two triangles, then you're rendering one triangle as a complete waste, because a pixel can just be one color and it can't be two triangles. Might be a bit too technical, sorry.
No. It's really not. I'm surprised myself that I understand, and I find it very interesting to talk about this stuff. I'm not sure about the viewers, but hey, it's my interview. I'm super fascinated about the inner workings of these things. Always am, and I always take great interest in hearing about it. So Nanite, and to mention again for viewers who are not sure, Nanite is a feature in Unreal Engine 5 that is a new form of LOD, and LOD means level of detail, and that is a function of transitioning the complexity of something that you see in the distance into something that's simpler to render to cut down on performance costs, because you don't need to see it you can't see it in high detail from far away. And Nanite is a new technique of eliminating that obvious transition because of the details that Master Stone mentioned, which I will have no chance of reiterating. I really like the idea of this, but I'm not particularly... I'm very tempered about it, because there seems to be a lot of performance issues with games transferring over to UE5, and that's one of my concerns. The transition over to UE5 seems to be particularly costly on one system. The trend thus far is that games that have released using UE5, particularly flat screen ones, have had to lean more on upscaling techniques in order to get a reasonable FPS, and it comes with a slew of CPU stutters and all of that stuff. So that's one of my concerns about the transition to UE5, in that it may facilitate a more powerful PC, or it just will come with all the stutters and stuff again.
That is an understandable concern, yeah. UE5 is designed for, on average, a better system than UE4. That's true. So usually consoles are quite an important target for engine makers and game devs. And UE4 was the engine designed for PlayStation 4 and the Xbox. I don't know what it was called. There are so many Xboxes by now. But PlayStation 4. And UE5 is the engine for PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S and the current generation of engines. So on average, it's expected that a UE5 game will need some more performance than a UE4 game, but every game dev still has the choice to make a UE5 game that's just as fast as a UE4 game. It's not the engine that forces you to somehow make your game less performant. It's just that the default settings are a lot higher in UE5. So if you start a new project as a developer in UE5, you will have all the fancy stuff turned on that UE4 might have turned off by default, where you would have manually turned it on. And maybe a lot of devs just keep all the really expensive stuff turned on and don't turn it off because they never knew how fast it could have been if they had turned the stuff that you might not even see off. And especially in VR, there's some graphics features do not work very well in VR and just not needed in VR, and so you should turn them off, yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if it would be beneficial to have a commercial game engine made that is solely for VR. I think that could be an interesting path. As you said, a lot of the visual techniques which are predominantly made for flat screen games don't translate too well into stereo view.
Making a game engine is a huge amount of work. If you look at the Unreal Engine as an example, then a lot of the code in Unreal Engine is still code from Unreal Engine 1 from 25 something years ago. And they just added more and more and more and more stuff on top. So if you would now sit down and try to create a new game engine that's made for VR, well, yeah, see you in 20 years if it should look anything like UE5.
Well, surely, if there was a big team, a big dedicated team or a company that set themselves to the task, it wouldn't take that long.
Yeah, a really big team might be able to do it in 10 years.
Really? 10 years, you think?
Yeah, it's similar to trying to create your own operating system. Imagine you assemble the best team and try to make something that rivals Windows.
Well, it can be done, I'm sure.
It can be done, but there's a reason why no one has done it, even though the target audience and market of a new operating system would be really large. And I mean, not many people like Windows, so if you could make a new operating system that has compatibility to Windows, but it's just way better, then people might want to use that, but no one is doing it. And yeah, it's because no one can compete with Microsoft on that. Just like I think no one could create a new engine now and compete with Unreal Engine and Unity. We will stay with this duopoly for quite a while. I mean, Godot does exist, and Godot will eventually be a great engine, but probably only for 2D games in the near and medium future and not for 3D games, because that's really where you need to spend all that time. Making an engine for 2D games is easy. With that, I do not mean flat games, I mean 2D mobile games. That's easy, but really good 3D rendering is super hard if you want to support all the fancy stuff that players expect nowadays.
I think it's just all programmers are lazy. I bet you that I could make a new engine in a couple of weeks. No worry.
Oh yeah, you could do it, yeah.
Definitely. I'm very talented. A couple of YouTube tutorials, get a few books off Humble Bundle. No worries. I've got it done. Give it a month.
You should try it.
I'll make a new engine for VR. No worries at all. Show those lazy devs what for. So, what's your feeling about the VR industry at present?
Yeah, the feeling about the VR industry. It's a bit sad, of course, that PC VR is not the main focus anymore, and actually a really small focus. Well, it's obvious why that is, because everyone buys Quest headsets and plays game on Quest standalone and not on PC. There are just not enough people who buy games on PC, so devs just have no incentive to create PC VR games because they just don't sell.
Why do you think that's the case? Why would people prefer to play Quest games than PC games? What's the motivation?
It's just a matter of how expensive it is to get into PC VR versus how expensive it is to get into Quest gaming. A Quest you can buy for, was it like $300 for a Quest 2? You buy it and you have it and you can play all the games that are in the Quest store. On PC, you need to buy a VR headset, which might be a Quest 2. It's a fine headset for playing PC games. But the big cost on PC is not the headset, it's the PC. You need to have a proper gaming PC. And if you really want to enjoy the VR games that were made for Steam VR for PC, you kind of have to pay at least, let's say, $1,500 for a PC. Ideally even more, because graphics cards just became super expensive recently in the past few years. So the entry hurdle to get into PC VR is just giant. It's not something that someone just, let me walk into a shop and buy a PC and a VR headset, because that will be at least $2,000, and you only do that if you really know what you want to do, or if you already are a PC gamer and then buy a cheap VR headset. But the Quest is something that a lot of people buy who might not even be gamers. They just see, okay, this thing exists, it's like a console, I buy it, don't have any experience with anything else before, I play games, I play the games, and it works. Don't need to know anything or need to pay much. So PC is at a giant disadvantage there.
Do you think, from your years of watching VR go by, do you think that there is anything better the PC market could have done to make it more attractive or more successful?
The PC market is...
Or PC VR, higher fidelity VR. Do you think that there are choices that could have been made or are...
I would put most of the blame on no one, basically.
Okay.
The main problem I see is a lot of bad luck. Bad luck with the GPU market. You had these, I don't remember the exact time, but like 5 years ago, roughly, when shortly after VR came out, I think, there was the first big crypto boom, cryptocurrencies. Or like, not the first big boom, but the first that was so big that no one could buy GPUs anymore, or maybe it even was the second already, I don't quite remember. But no one could buy GPUs. You walked into a store and there were 0 GPUs in the store. Just around the time where people wanted to get into VR. If no one can buy a GPU, then you cannot get into VR, and you might have some GPU from a few years ago that's not good enough for VR. VR needs really good GPUs. And then at some point GPUs were in stock again, but then unfortunately 2 or 3 years later, there was the second big crypto boom and all GPUs were out of stock again. And you couldn't buy GPUs. A ton of people sit on their old GPUs and no one could buy any. The prices skyrocketed to 3 times what was normal before. And then at some point, GPUs were in stock again. But with all these experiences of people buying GPUs for infinite money, Nvidia and AMD never reduced the prices again to what they were before that, because they were used to infinite profits now. And getting into VR just became so much more expensive for the average user compared to relatively what you had to pay 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And GPU progress, the practical GPU progress became much slower. You couldn't upgrade your GPU every 3 years to a new 70 series from Nvidia anymore. Many years ago, people did that. Can buy a new 70 series GPU from Nvidia every few years. It's like $400, $500 or something. Have great performance and everything is great. But now the current GPU generation is, the 4090 is great and everything below is quite bad in value. And that's really not a fun market to get into. So if you don't already have a great GPU, you have a problem. Or a lot of money. If you have a lot of money, okay, it doesn't matter, but the people who have a lot of money are not the people who have a lot of time, usually. And for people to actually buy games, you need to have people who have a lot of money, or not a lot of money, but money to spend on games, and a lot of time to play the games. The time is really more important. I mean, games are kind of cheap. The price of a game is not the hurdle to get into a game. The price of the hardware you need is the entry barrier. So if you have the hardware, then you can buy the games, no problem. But if you cannot afford the hardware, then what choice do you have? You need to go for the cheap hardware, and that's the quest now. So I think PC just had bad luck with how the GPU market went. If the crypto booms hadn't happened, then GPUs would be like twice as good now for the same price. And so many more people could afford really good VR. And it's not just the GPU market, it's also that VR headsets became more and more high resolution. The first Oculus Rift and HTC Vive were really quite low res. Everyone saw the screen door effect and looked not great, but you got used to it and then had fun playing games. And the games worked fine even on your GTX 1060. But now if you buy a Quest 2 or Quest 3, you have like 3 times the resolution compared to what the Oculus Rift and HTC Vive back then had. And it's not obvious to a lot of people, but a headset with 3 times the resolution needs a GPU that's 3 times faster compared to what you needed 6 years ago. And no one now has a GPU that's 6 times faster. So what that means is you have these high-res headsets now, and only very few people can afford the GPUs to actually drive these headsets. And then it feels like, well, the game kind of looks blurry because it just cannot set the resolution high enough to actually play the game. And yeah, that's a problem, and it reduces the perceived quality of VR. You know, like if you have a 4K monitor and you watch a 1080p video, it looks blurry to you. If you have a 1080p monitor and you watch a 1080p video, it looks normal to you. And we're kind of in the place now where everyone has a 4K monitor on their head, but the graphics cards can only do 1080p for most people. And then what's the point in these beautiful games?
Yeah. Not to mention that many of the games also don't really take advantage of motion as much as they could. So it's a double whammy there.
Yeah, so that is of course quite sad about the VR market. But the good thing is that will fix itself over time. We just have to wait. We just have to wait until GPUs are good enough, and then suddenly VR will be amazing for everyone. We just don't quite know how long it will take for GPUs to be good enough. Might be 10 years, but at some point it will happen. And in the meantime, it's really like the savior of high-end VR, I think, is PSVR 2. Because everyone by now, I mean, PSVR, PS5 were also out of stock for a long time, but now everyone can walk into a shop, buy a PS5, buy a PSVR 2, and a lot of people have PS5s, and play really high-end VR games, who were only those that were ported to PSVR 2, but if a dev has made a really cool game, then there's really no reason to not port it to PSVR 2. So that's where hopefully most people can now experience all the really high-end PC VR games as well, without having to have infinite money.
It's very well said, Master Stone.
Thanks.
GPU thing is definitely, you made a very good point there, something I didn't consider quite as much. And it will get there eventually, of that I'm sure. VR will take over. It will become the new norm, especially when the tech matures and headsets aren't as heavy and clarity in general improves and the software gets more efficient, ideally. It will get there eventually.
Yeah, but of course this issue of high-end VR being so expensive is of course especially sad for devs like me that care so much about making a game that's really beautiful and should take advantage of all the awesome GPU power that's available. Because if you make Beat Saber, then it really doesn't matter if your players have a very cheap GPU or an expensive GPU because the game looks the same everywhere. But in CubeVR you really notice if you have a good GPU. And it's not quite obvious to everyone how expensive it actually is to render performance-wise VR games that try to be beautiful. So sometimes I have heard people tell me, oh, my PC can run Beat Saber beautifully at 90 Hz. Why does CubeVR lag?
I guess they're assuming that because it's a voxel game that it shouldn't be too demanding, or they're just ignorant.
And they're just thinking it's VR and my PC can play other VR games, so CubeVR should run as well because it's just another VR game. And it's fine. I mean, we cannot expect that everyone understands PC hardware and technology super well. You shouldn't have to be an expert in this stuff to enjoy games. You should be just a gamer who enjoys games. But on PC VR, it's really hard to just be a gamer who enjoys games without understanding the technology to really know how to make best use of it. PC VR is complicated.
It is. And beyond the factors that you've mentioned too, it's not only having a PC that's capable of running VR with the extortionate prices of GPUs, but it's also considering factors like base stations, having a sizable area that you can set up the VR to begin with.
I think that's not as large of a problem as some people might think, because you do need this area to play a Quest 2 games as well. It's not like a Quest 2 is played by people who just sit down and never move. It's designed with the same principles of motion controllers and you stand in the room.
I don't know. You can move in a lot of games, but I'd note design trends that you don't really need to. I would say a significant proportion of VR games are designed to accommodate you sitting or standing like a statue, as I've said publicly before, and just moving your wrists a little. And that's all that's needed of you to fully succeed in the game experience. Yes, you can move around physically if you wish, but rarely are games designed in a way that encourage or reward you for doing so.
Yeah, but in theory, the ability is there.
In theory, yes, but you know how we humans are. We take the path of least resistance, and if we can optimize something or avoid exerting any extra effort, even if we may get more gratification for it without our realizing, if we can avoid doing extra things or making extra effort, then we will. That's why I'm always a proponent of devs in general needing to think more like parents and what is best for players to a certain extent in forcing us to engage in certain ways. But of course that comes with many risks and pitfalls, so...
Yeah, you still need players to look at your game and think, oh, that's fun. I quite often get the comment when people who haven't played CubeVR, who just see a screenshot or a video, small trailer, comment stuff like, oh, this looks like so much work. When I want to play a game, I want to play a game and not work. It's not the majority who says, it's just like 5% of people, but it's still a comment that I read quite often. And so it shows when people see, oh, I have to move my hand. Every block needs to be mined by my hand. Everything needs to be crafted by my hands. That already looks to some people like, okay, no, sorry, I'm lazy.
Yeah, and there's not much that you can do about that as a dev. It's all up to the individual's attitude and a shift in the perspective and consensus about what gaming can be and also what VR is and can be too. That's why I mentioned earlier, I still feel slightly like VR has a little bit of an identity crisis in that there is an insecurity and uncertainty on how much it wants to actually utilize and lean on the physical motion aspect of itself. It's not quite sure yet because of players like that. And I think that players like that and ones who are maybe in the middle tend to be more vocal on the internet. So their voices perhaps become more elevated.
Yeah, most developers have no idea what the average VR gamer actually wants, I think. So it's just really hard to know. Like I also, at the moment, I have no idea what the average PSVR 2 player will think about this stuff. I'm really experienced now with what PC players say about CubeVR and what they like in the game, what they dislike, but console gamers are different. And at the moment, I still have no clue which kind of things I might hear from those that I might not have heard as much from PC gamers, because PC gamers and console gamers are just a bit different. I think, for example, that probably more people want to play console sitting on the couch because it's just more normal with console. So there will probably be more people who actually want to sit down and play cyubeVR on a PSVR 2, which usually never happens on PC. But I think on console that will happen more because it's just what people are used to. They want to be comfortable and just enjoy the game, especially with PSVR 1. Many games only had gamepad support because the motion controllers really sucked. So yeah, I think PC VR players are already more used to moving and using their body, probably compared to console gamers, console VR players.
Possibly, yeah. Your logic is sound. It makes sense. I guess there's only one way to find out, but getting your game exposed on PlayStation VR 2 will definitely be an exciting thing for you.
Yeah, I hope so too.
A bit more exposure is definitely needed there. Talking about you as a gamer, so what headset do you own and what games do you play?
What headset do I own? The list is too long, I think, because if you ask as a gamer, then I'm a game developer. That's why I own a lot of headsets.
So what's your daily driver?
Daily driver is the Valve Index. It's the Index ever since it came out, and it's still the Index because I have no idea which other headset could do everything as well as the Index on average. On average, it's just the best headset, I think, still so far. I don't know any better one.
What about the big screen beyond? Has that interested you?
I find it interesting regarding the technology that it's so small and high-res and reasonably good FOV. Not quite as good as the Index, I think. A little bit smaller. And I really like FOV. I do not want to go down in FOV. I think FOV is super important for immersion, so I have some doubts how much I would enjoy it if it's a step down, even if it's just a small step down. And then the audio solution is just, the Index has really good audio. It sounds super good to have this over-the-ear audio, and I care a lot about good audio. And the big screen beyond does not have that, and that's a problem.
You can buy a separate headphone thing as part of it, I think. It's an extra £100 or so.
But is it as good as the Index headphones?
Apparently so. I can only parrot what I've heard in marketing and hearsay, but apparently so. And the microphone either rivals, well, not that that's important to you, but the microphone also is better or the same as the Index. So I've heard.
Okay, if the audio is good as the Index audio, that's good. There's still the downside that you need to have an iPhone to scan your face to get a big screen beyond. I like technology. I like open platforms. I do not use an iPhone. So that's a problem. I mean, I can understand that a lot of people like iPhones. But when you really like to tinker with your technology and you need to care about getting a jailbreak that works at the moment for your iPhone, I wouldn't always have to care about that. I just want a phone that I can use in the way I want to use without any extra hoops. So yeah, I do not have an iPhone and I would need to get a big screen beyond, and that's a problem.
What games do you play when or if you play outside of being a dev?
I generally do not play many games. I think a lot of game devs do not play many games. That's quite common.
Yeah, I've heard this before. I'm quite mixed about that. I can get it, but I think they probably should play more.
I also think that it would be good if game devs played more games, but it's really hard to motivate yourself to play games when you always have in the back of your mind, oh, I'm just sitting down for hours and playing this game, and all this time I could have spent programming on my own game. And you always feel bad for any second you spend in another game. And it's hard to get yourself into the state where you want to play a game. So I only do it for the games where I feel they're really important to the whole VR market. There I force myself to play them and enjoy them, of course. But how many of these games are there where I really feel this force to, okay, there's no way you can make a VR game without having played this game. That happened for Half-Life Alyx. That was one of those games. I was completely clear to me, okay, if Valve finally releases their VR game, you have to play it. That's the new gold standard that everyone will talk about, everyone will play, everyone will buy the VR headset for. So that's what you have to play and look at closely, see all the cool things they do, and make sure to do them at least the same cool in my own game. That's why there are gravity gloves in cyubeVR. I did not think about gravity gloves on my own. Gravity gloves was something I played Half-Life Alyx and I finished playing it, and I thought, okay, first thing I will do is sit down and implement gravity gloves in cyubeVR. I dropped everything else and implemented gravity gloves in cyubeVR. And that was the right choice. Everyone loved it. It looked awesome. It felt awesome. Got like 1,000 upvotes on Reddit when I posted about it because everyone in that moment was enjoying gravity gloves. it made the game so much better. Before that, you actually had to bend down to grab everything from the ground, which was always something that some people disliked in cyubeVR, but only some people, and most people were fine with it. But it was always something where I thought, okay, I should do something so that you do not have to bend down to grab everything from the ground. It created some fun mechanics where people were always crafting out of chests that were placed on chest height, like a bit higher, so that you could stand in front of them, grab stuff out of the chest and craft, because always bending down to items on the ground that you dropped there would just be too annoying. And with gravity gloves, it now became a lot of fun to just make a pile of items on the ground and craft, because every gravity glove grab is like a small fun minigame. Everyone loves gravity gloves.
Exactly. And if you can, and I think that's a really key point too, is turning those little actions where your intent is only to pick up something. If you can find a way to gamify that and make it intuitive and engaging in itself, then you're on to a winner. And if you can do that with as many things as possible, then great. Big thumbs up.
Yeah. That was the big thing that I noticed in Half-Life Alyx when I played it. Apart from that, of course, it also looked really good. So from that point on, I was fine if people said that cyubeVR is only the second most pretty game in VR. I can say that another great feature in Alyx is the radial menu. It took me a while to appreciate that. When I played Alyx, I didn't really think much about this radial menu. But actually cyubeVR, I'm not sure when was the first time that you played cyubeVR.
It's about 2 years ago.
Yeah, but before that, it was probably quite soon after I edited it, because I edited shortly after Haby's video, where a lot of people then found cyubeVR through his video. But yeah, radial menu, cyubeVR for a long time had a control scheme that was a bit hard to understand at first. I didn't really design the control scheme of the game in the beginning with having in mind that everyone needs to be able to pick up the game and immediately understand everything. In the beginning, I had the not super perfect thought that it's fine to have features in the game where you have to read the manual for. And no one reads manuals.
Yeah.
And so if something in the game requires you to read the manual, then many players will never understand it. And so that's why at some point I completely threw out the old control scheme of cyubeVR and replaced it with the Half-Life Alyx control scheme, basically, which was the radial menu and then also shoulder slots that Half-Life Alyx did not have, but they just fit cyubeVR well. So, and of course, Half-Life Alyx also did not have such a large radial menu. I think Half-Life Alyx was limited to 4 radial menu slots. cyubeVR has 8, so more. But still, the radial menu in cyubeVR works very similarly to Half-Life Alyx, and it just works really good. The basic idea of a radial menu, I mean, it was not introduced by Half-Life Alyx, but Half-Life Alyx did it in a really visually pleasing way. And that's really what made me think, okay, this is good, because it's not just working and easy to understand, but this radial menu actually looks really good. When you just open the radial menu and watch the individual slots with the tools in them, I'm not sure if you ever just paused for a moment in cyubeVR and opened the radial menu and watched the animation of the radial menu.
I vaguely remember how it pops up.
Yeah, but it actually has quite intricate animations on the individual slots and double layers of tools, tool icons with a shadow behind and a slight movement that leans towards your hand when you move your hand and all this stuff. So I spent a lot of time on these tiny details of the radial menu.
Why?
Because it's something you use all the time in the game and something that every player immediately sees. And even if they will never notice all these small details, I think subconsciously it's one of the things that really makes you go, oh wow, this game looks really pretty. Because even the tool selection looks really good. Even if these small things that are kind of useless regarding the graphics, because they're just interactions to select something. But if even those look really good, that subconsciously makes you think, oh wow, this is a really beautiful game.
I think it can be underestimated, the power of those subconscious effects that the little details have in building the perception of the bigger picture. Very important.
Yeah, but I think it also took me like 2 weeks of sitting down to make all these radial menu smooth animations and stuff to make it just look pretty. Actually, that was the first thing I did. I first implemented all the visuals to make it look super awesome, and only after that I implemented to make it actually work.
You are very much an audio-visual person, it seems. It's very important to you.
Yeah, it's the stuff that excites me. I mean, writing code that works is great, and I'm a programmer. I love optimizing code. I love writing code. I don't need to see what it's doing as pixels on a screen. I'm also fully happy if I just have a function in front of me and optimize it and it needs one less CPU cycle, and that's awesome. But when it comes to what's actually visible to the player, then what excites me is when they see something that's just looking beautiful, and that's why I like to start with that. And because actually I'm a programmer, so getting the logic to work is always the easiest part for me. Making something look beautiful is the harder part, because I do not immediately know how to make something beautiful. I need to try stuff out, tweak it, look at it, ask people for feedback to really get to this where at the end then say, okay, this is beautiful. I don't have this immediate eye for what's beautiful. And when doing something, I like to start with the hard part. So the hard part is making it look beautiful, and the easy part is making it work.
There's a big difference between the function of something and the aesthetics of something. It requires a different mind, a different approach, for sure.
Yeah.
I do think, though, that VR devs especially, and I'm not pointing a finger at you, but going back to the original root of this recent topic, I do think it would probably be better if VR devs played VR more in a general way, especially since it's still in such an experimental, growing phase that keeping one's ear to the ground on what works, what doesn't work, what feels good, and just be abreast and a part of the scene more would definitely help, because as a consumer, I feel that there are still too many titles coming out where they're making choices and decisions about how grips work, various factors are implemented, where as a regular user of VR, it is head-scratching as to how they still think that doing it this way is good when it's been done so much better in many other ways. And I do wonder if it's a case of, again, those devs are not really a part of the crowd or playing more. So yeah, that's just my opinion on that. I really do think it would be better, especially since...
Do understand that, yeah, but I'm not sure if that will ever be fixed, because it's quite normal that most of the games you play, or a lot of the games you play, probably are done by devs who've only played 2 or 3 other VR games in their life and who will completely try to reinvent the wheel. And just because another dev did something in a good way doesn't mean they know about it, so they will try to do it differently, which might be worse.
Well, this is where content creators like myself hopefully can come in and sort of bridge the gap there, as it is my mission to bring attention to those exceptional cases or the details which matter from a user perspective, at least.
Yeah, and I quite like that, you know. I like that I can go to YouTube, go to a channel like yours, watch a review of a game, and you just tell me all the good mechanics that is in a game. I don't need to play it myself. I can just listen to you and you explain me all the awesome stuff in all the games you've played. Then I know, okay, these 1 or 2 mechanics in the game are great. So if I ever need them, I can look at that game and see if that might be something I need to think about and improve upon. But I don't need to play it myself until then. You know, that's great.
So long as one is deemed as trustworthy enough, of course. And I remember a message that you sent me a while ago, actually, on the review that I did for Hubris, and I praised the controller ghosts appearing. If your virtual arms collide with something, your controllers will fade in, and how thankful that you were for me highlighting that detail, and that you may add it at some point in Cube. That was a lovely message.
Yeah, that was something I hadn't seen before, and I hadn't played Hubris, because as usual I don't play many games, so watching a 10 or 20 or 30-minute review is so much easier and focused than having to play through the whole game myself.
And then you won't feel bad about playing it too.
Yeah.
So what's next for Cube then? What are you well, except for the porting to PlayStation VR 2 in terms of features and mechanics after you're done with the porting, what did you have in mind that you wanted to add?
Oh, I have a million things in mind. You can go to roadmap.
I've seen the roadmap.
I generally do not think I had much, because everything that you plan can easily be changed by a bunch of player feedback you get that you didn't get before. So, you know, I now work on the PSVR 2 release, and I'm sure I will get a lot of feedback from PSVR 2 players, because I've never done anything for the PlayStation platform, and I want to do it really well, that they are happy. So if everyone suddenly requests something that I didn't think of, I will probably first add that to the PlayStation build, because I want everyone there to be happy. And yeah, I know I optimized the PC game for 6 years, so that is really good. It's what PC game players expect, but it can easily happen that I overlook something on PlayStation that I need to fix after releasing it. So yeah, that could be something completely new that comes up that I don't know yet. But if that does not happen, if everyone is just happy, then like I mentioned, I would like to update the game to UE5, Unreal Engine 5, which will take a few weeks.
A few weeks, not months?
No, usually, I mean, I quite often do engine updates. Some people think that, Unreal Engine 4 existed since a few years, and now Unreal Engine 5 exists. So wow, this has to be an amazing amount of work to port a game from one engine to a totally different engine. But no, UE5 is actually just basically a 4.x release. They just called it 5 instead of 4 point something as before. So it's really easy to port a game from UE4 to UE5 in theory. In practice, Epic basically said, okay, going from UE4 to UE5 should be roughly as difficult as going up 4 versions of UE4 or 3 versions of UE4 at once, which is what I've always done with cyubeVR. I've done an engine update roughly once a year, and there roughly is 3 UE4 engine updates every year, so I always skip 3 versions at once. So the update to UE5 is not actually that much more different, other than it's now, well, I've waited quite a while, so it's now like 6 at once instead of 3 at once, so yeah, okay, maybe twice as long. But Epic cares about that games can relatively easily switch from UE4 to UE5. You do not have to redo anything in theory, you just have to test everything and make sure it still works. And I have the big problem that I'm someone who loves optimizations, and that means I'm not like most devs and just use the engine in the way that it's supposed to be used. But instead I so often think, okay, you know what, this small thing in the engine here, if I would tweak it a bit, it would just work so much better for my game. It would be faster or look better or be better in some way. And then I go into the engine code and learn how exactly that stuff there works and improve it. And so I have like a list of over 100 commits changes on top of the Unreal Engine source code. And these changes are always, that's what takes the few weeks to fix every time I update the engine version, because those are changes on top of code that then sometimes changes with new engine versions. That's the code that does not just work. Game code will just keep working. But engine changes are not something that just keeps working. So that is what I always spend a few weeks on getting to work again.
It's something that becomes a bit of a disadvantage as a solo dev, but your enjoyment of squeezing a few cycles, extra cycles from the CPU and optimizing, which again, I praise, I can't praise more. I think that attitude is so rare and is really needed in today's software world, where a concern about what the CPU is actually doing and how that affects performance is just not there. So I value people like yourself who actually give a damn, because the end user has had to shoulder the burden of the complacency of modern devs and their lack of wanting to actually understand what's going on and to make their game performant. And I know it's a complicated topic. I know there are many reasons. So endless praise for you there, but I understand your hesitation when I praise you, when you said yeah in that uncertain way, because I know that it delays you and it may be frowned upon by the common consensus. But I can only tell you that as an end user who has grown up seeing the decline of performance and care about those things in today's software, that I appreciate your obsessive perfectionist attitude about getting those cycles out, even if it comes at a cost of time.
Yeah, but optimization is something that everyone can like, no matter their age, I think. It's not something I think that people back then liked more.
But it was it was standard. It was part of the course. It was part of being a programmer or a certain area of programmer that you would do it more commonly.
But because the hardware was so much slower, it's not by choice, it's just people were forced to actually think about optimization. Because CPUs were slow, GPUs were slow, you had to optimize the code or you couldn't ship a product. And now, in comparison, you can just do stuff in the easiest way and it's still a shippable product. It might have some performance issues, but you will get money for it. So the incentive to actually optimize your stuff is just infinitely lower now compared to 20 years ago.
And it's something that I disagree with. I think that we should strive to have better standards and better practices, irrespective of how transparent those results are or not, because those attitudes are not only about the now, they pass on to future generations. And it's about maintaining those things and teaching our children and our children's children in order to have standards and care and consideration about these things. I think the attitude goes beyond just optimizing and saving cycles. It's very much a human emotional thing that applies to many other aspects of life. So that's why I always praise that attitude when I encounter it.
Yeah, and it's good to praise it, I think, and I would also always praise it because I just think it's something every programmer should learn because it's fun. If you've never tried to optimize something, you might not even know how fun it is. If you never had to do it because your code just always worked well enough, yeah, you're missing out on something that's actually very fun. Try to learn a bit of C or C++, because there are not that many different languages that you can optimize very low level. You need to have some language that allows you to see the assembly code that comes out from the compiler, or directly write assembly. I mean, that's learn to write assembly for a bit. It's also fun. But then for practical stuff, write C++ code. Look at what the compiler outputs. Look at the assembly. Look at the instructions. Just need to know a very tiny amount of assembly to understand what it's doing. And even if you don't understand it, just count how many instructions there are. And if you have a function with 50 instructions and you think, wait, I'm just adding 1 + 1, then yeah, it shouldn't be 50 instructions.
Exactly.
And just think about what you're doing there instead of adding 1 + 1. maybe you're, I don't know, looping through an array to find out what actually is the first value, and you can completely skip it because it's just not necessary. Or yeah, there's so much stuff that happens under the hood that you might not notice if you never actually look at what the compiler does. And the more you look at it, the better you automatically become at writing code that does not do these stupid things.
Exactly. And hopefully, if someone aspires to be a programmer, that they would want to have these skills and they would want to be able to understand these things, at least at a basic level, to make the best product that they can that runs as well as is possible. And that's not even to mention the extra layers of abstraction that other software adds on top of things. So you could be doing what you think is a simple command or instruction, but because you're doing it on that particular engine or software, it's actually doing some extra things in the background that you're unaware of.
That's very true.
Yeah. Which adds on top, and what you think should be a very simple performant instruction because you're doing it in that particular software and you don't realize it's automatically doing lots of other stuff there. Yeah, it's not as performant as you think. And then one thing leads to another, your game has stuttering, people complain, and you don't know why, and yeah, just learn your stuff.
Yeah, and actually this is one big reason why you've asked me if I ever regretted to use Unreal Engine. No, I didn't, but I was always quite happy that I didn't pick Unity, because Unity didn't even allow you to read the code of the engine. So when you called a Unity function, you do not have the choice to know what it's actually doing internally. You have to read the documentation and hope it explains something about what's happening. But if you were not a AAA studio and paying them a lot of money, you could not read their source code. While Unreal Engine was always, since Unreal Engine 4, kinda open source, like not open source license, which is something specific, but open source as in that you can read the source code and can modify the source code. So if I call some kind of Unreal Engine function in cyubeVR, I can see exactly what's happening. I can see every instruction from the CPU that comes out of that Unreal Engine function. And then I can decide, okay, should I design my mechanic around using this Unreal Engine function? Or should I maybe just implement the feature myself without the help of Unreal Engine, which might take a bit longer but run a lot better? Because often these engine functions are not necessarily designed for exactly the thing you're doing. They're designed to work well in the average game. And the average game needs a lot of features, and a lot of different features because there are so many different games, but often it's completely overkill for what you need to do in your game. So sometimes it's just a good idea to not use an engine feature, even if it exists, and instead do it yourself. And suddenly it can run 10 times faster.
This Master Stone is why I confidently refer to you as a true dev. This is the kind of mindset and attitude that I would hope all would have as standard, who work in a particular area. I mean, I know there are different sections, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks. But I can also totally understand that it's just way too much time investment for a lot of people who just want to make games. If you're really someone who just wants to make a game, then to think about all this stuff on top just adds a year until you can release your game. And for a lot of people, it's just they might not have the motivation or to actually invest into delaying their game by so much just to make it optimized in a way that they are happy with from a perspective of a programmer who loves optimization.
I don't know. It's another thing I struggle to empathize with. If I set out to make a game, it's not just about the game itself. For me, it's about making a well-oiled systemic creation that displays itself as a game. If I personally were setting out to make something, then I consider the optimization that you mentioned a process, a part of making that game. Just making the game also equals making it run well. And I wouldn't want to put out a game that I know would struggle on systems because I couldn't be bothered optimizing it or trying to understand how to make it work better. For me, that is the game making process. And I would be doing a disservice to myself and to the consumer, the person who would be playing my game, if I didn't care to try and make it run well. So yeah, I struggle to empathize with those who don't.
It's something you would also need to be able to explain to your publisher if you have one, if you're not a small indie dev, that you please would like to be able to delay your game by a year and have them fund you for 1 year more before it comes out, just because you need to satisfy your needs to make something nice and optimized. I don't think I could convince a publisher to do that just because I love it so much. For a lot of people, it just matters to have the money to actually work on the game. And without the money, it's hard. And if that means you need to release it quickly, then you need to release it quickly and can't think about that stuff.
That is an excellent point. A very, very, very good point, actually. Yeah, I guess a big factor on that too will be the attitude of the day. And the attitude of the modern times, at least as we speak, is getting things out as fast as possible, the minimum viable product. Quality is no longer the paramount concern to a certain point, unlike before at least anyway.
Yeah, and you could look at it and think about, okay, how much did it actually benefit cyubeVR to be made by a developer who loves optimization? And what's the answer to that?
There isn't one really. You could come at that from so many perspectives and depends on what you value. So I don't think that there is really an answer, a definitive one at least.
Yeah, that's fine, yeah. I think most players never really notice it much. Most players will judge the game by how well it's running on their hardware. If they have slow hardware and it's a very pretty game, then it might not run great, and then they will think it's just an unoptimized game.
It depends on how old they are, though, I think, because, and this will be a constant trend, you'll have younger ones who are in their teens who are only just getting into playing games, and they have no point of reference, no experience with this level of fidelity and interactivity could run this well on this system, whereas people of my age will have the frame of reference and have the experience. And so if I were to get something that looked only a little bit better than what I had 10 or 15 years ago, but ran exponentially worse, then I'm going to make that comparison, of course. And that will probably be a constant cycle. The ones who grow up will be able to tell, and the younger ones won't, and it will keep on going and going and going.
Yeah, maybe, but I think actually if you look at the Oculus Quest, Meta Quest store, many people say that games really get a good rating on the Quest store much more easily than on Steam. That Quest players are just way more generous with their ratings, that even bad games get a ton of 5-star ratings. While on Steam, if you do something bad, your game will have a bad review score. So, and the average age of Quest gamers is quite a lot lower than PSVR gamers, because a lot of young people get a Quest for their birthday or Christmas or something. You don't give your kids a $2,000 PC usually. So actually it seems that younger people who just get a cheap Quest and play games are less critical than those older people who play games on Steam, PC VR games.
Very much so, and it makes perfect sense. I would also go further and say that a lot of the louder voices that are seen in internet forums tend to be that of younger ones as well. I would, if one were to take a big handful of the chatty users in game forums and social media, a significant proportion of them would be young or younger-minded, and I mean teens, maybe early 20s, and yeah, it makes perfect sense, really. And they have no point of comparison. For them, this is all new. They have no idea that what they're seeing could be done better or more efficiently in certain ways. And because they are more in tune with the current social trends, then they will display themselves more online, and their voices will become more dominant in that environment, I feel. It's something I mentioned in a recent video about online communities.
Okay, yeah. People who don't have much reference will have lower standards, yeah. And it's also kind of obvious then that developers might prefer developing for those who have lower standards because it's just easier to make something that makes people happy. And that's, of course, a bit of a problem, right?
Well, yeah, it can be a problem. It can not be. At the end of the day, do they get what they want? Do they succeed? Do they get the money they want? Are the players who do play it happy enough? Then even if those who have higher standards and are comparing are dissatisfied, do they really matter? At the end of the day, do people like me really matter, especially if I'm in the minority? It's very arguable that my kind of voice, my kind of preference doesn't or shouldn't hold a lot of sway in today's market. And in a way, that's a pity, but I can also understand it. Even if I am disparaging myself, I can understand.
Yeah, and sometimes it collides with the type of game you want to make. Like, I always wanted to make the most beautiful VR voxel game that has amazing VR mechanics and looks amazing and wows you from the moment you play it. And this type of game is not really compatible with Quest, of course. On Quest, it just doesn't work because the GPU is not good enough. And it also kind of requires that the player actually appreciates really good graphics and good mechanics. And if the standards are too low, then from my perspective, it would become too boring to make a cool game. I want to be held to high standards. I don't want that just I do something that I don't like and people somehow think, oh, that's amazing. that would feel wrong. And so I would, of course, prefer if more people would actually look at games with a high standard, judge them all from a high standard, and then see, okay, when I look at these games all with my high standard, then I see, okay, cyubeVR is a good game. But not every game is just good because it's just good.
There's two questions that I wanted to ask there. The first is, why do you feel that way?
I mean, when everyone can make something good, then making something good is no longer special, right?
I mean, why do you want to be held to higher standards? What influences that? Why do you desire to be held to higher standards?
But I have a high standard for the stuff I do because I'm very perfectionist. And if I'm not held to a high standard, then it's completely useless to be perfectionist with my stuff. Then it would always only feel like a waste to try to perfect everything, because no one would care. If everyone would just like it, even in the simple and boring implementation, then what's the challenge of making something that really satisfies my perfectionism?
But it would make you more wealthy and you would get more popularity. Is that not a value to you?
I don't know. Some more financial success would be good compared to what CubeVR has now, because it would make me more confident in that I can keep working on it for a long time, that is the important part, that I can keep working on it for a long time, and ideally hire even more people to work on it to get everything done much faster. But yeah, first priority, I need to be able to work on it, to implement all the stuff I want to add. Second priority, I would like to have the money to make it much faster by hiring more people. So yeah, that's the aspect of it would be nice to be more wealthy in that regard. And social status, I mean, yeah, I want people to say, okay, your game is great. It's one of the best VR games I've played. It changed my life. Or, well, don't need people to tell me that it changed their life, but I want them to tell me, okay, if I had not played this, I would really be missing something. I would have missed a really cool experience. But if everything they play is a good experience to them, they would not tell me that anymore. There would not be much social status if everything is good. Only if few things are good and a lot of stuff is average or bad, then the good stuff stands out. And for that, people need to have an understanding of what's good and what's bad.
But that crowd doesn't have the frame of reference, as we've just mentioned. So, as far as I know on the Quest, there are not really any voxel games out there. So even if you were to downgrade significantly and release on Quest, then you would still be very unique and have a big shot, and you would get more instant recognition, status, and probably money. So
that might be the case, yeah. I constantly have people tell me, okay, you know what? This looks great, but I want it on Quest. Is it on Quest? I say, no, it's not. You can connect the Quest to the PC and then play it if your PC is good enough. There's no question I get more often than, can I play this on Quest standalone? No? Okay, when? So of course, yeah, I know I would make so much more money and stuff if I would bring it to Quest. But how should I justify that to my own perfectionism and my own image of what I want the game to look like? How would this game look like on a Quest? How could I still sleep at night happily, knowing how ugly I made my game?
Your standards and your principles are more important than the monetary gain or surface level values.
Yeah, because I got into VR with this whole thinking of most VR games look too simple, too not impressive regarding the graphics. That's why I want to make a game that does it better. And then downgrading that whole aspect just to make more money, that would feel like selling my soul.
Your soul is priceless, would you say?
Yeah.
Good to hear.
But if I at some point might see, okay, the game does not sell on PC at all anymore and no one buys it on PSVR as well, I mean, I somehow need to live. I am working on this full time. I need to pay my bills from the sales of CubeVR. So if I would suddenly not make any money anymore with PC or PSVR 2, then yeah, I would probably have to try to bring it to Quest, make it ugly, because it would be the choice between doing that or completely stopping working on the game. And then, yeah, it's still the better choice to make it ugly and make it work on Quest. But I just hope that day doesn't come.
Are there any other games that you would like to make eventually?
No.
Okay.
I think a lot of people think, oh, you're a dev, you have probably a million ideas that you want to make. But I really enjoy working on CubeVR. And if I work on CubeVR for the rest of my life, that's fine. I want to make an awesome game, and the longer I work on the game, the more awesome it is. If I now start to work on a new game, it will start at zero awesomeness. Starting from something that already is awesome and making it more awesome is a much shorter path than starting from zero and making something new that's awesome. So yeah, giving up that amount of awesomeness that is there already, I don't know, it just wouldn't feel right to me. And CubeVR is a game that can grow forever. So as long as I can afford to work on it, I want to work on it. It's not like I would ever run out of features to add, unless I finally get to the point where I can hire 100 people and add everything at once simultaneously in parallel that every player wants. If that happens, okay, then maybe I'm done after 3 years and want to make something new. But while there's a roadmap of infinite cool things that this type of game can get, because it's a voxel sandbox game and there's still so much stuff that can be done, yeah.
I admire that very much. Someone who sticks to their standards and principles and is willing to take the more difficult road to uphold those. Always a very, very, very admirable trait that should be praised and is not upheld or praised anywhere near enough in today's society, unfortunately.
I'm probably also just very stubborn too. I mean, how many devs are there still who've been working since almost 8 years on the PC VR only game? I might be the only one, I don't know. So many devs switched to doing only Quest games in the past few years. I feel like I'm part of a group that's dying out of PSVR only devs. I mean, I am not a PSVR only dev anymore. I'm doing PSVR 2 now too, but high-end VR only devs, which I would always classify PSVR and PSVR 2 as high-end VR.
Yes, I've no idea how many other devs have stuck around high-end for that long. You're the only one I personally know, at least. But again, I respect your path very much, and it's difficult, but keeping one's principles and standards is a rare action that we need to see more of. It's just a pity that such things are not upheld. And you say it may be stubbornness, yes, but these things are probably two sides of the same coin, right? There has to be a level of stubbornness in order to uphold principles and standards, so they complement each other.
Yeah. Back on the topic of performance, eye tracking is just so important. And we don't have eye tracking on PC at the moment. And that's a big thing. Like, VR needs eye tracking. Eye tracking is fundamental to good VR. And because you always have this issue of not enough performance, yeah, but there is no point in rendering everything in high detail. What you really need to do is render the stuff your eyes look at. And it's only a very small fraction of the whole image that your eyes can actually focus on. So if you just render this small image sharply, then the image looks amazing, even if everything around it is totally blurry. And currently on PC, there just is no way to do this nicely. There is no hardware, no software. I mean, there is a bit of some VR headsets have the hardware, but they're not in the mainstream VR headsets that people use. It needs to be mainstream. Everyone needs to have it. Otherwise, it makes no sense to write the software. And that's a big thing. Like, once we reach the point where eye tracking is normal on PC VR and fully supported by NVIDIA and AMD in the rendering pipelines, like, it needs to be a native feature done by the GPU manufacturers in the drivers, in the hardware. It cannot just be something that a headset manufacturer comes up with. It needs to be native. Once that happens, PC will get such a big jump in quality. It's like jump as big as has never happened before. And that needs to happen. And it has happened on PSVR 2. And that's just so nice as a developer to see this somewhat weak console. PS5 is roughly equivalent to a 2070 on PC. So 2070 and the really high resolution of a PSVR 2. It's quite high res, much higher than the Valve Index. Normally on PC, everything would look bad. But on PSVR 2, stuff can look really good because you just need to render this small part of the image with really high fidelity, and it looks amazing. Like, you can have a game that looks as sharp on PSVR 2 as it does on a PC with a 3090, even with the 3090 having 2 to 3 times the performance and memory of a 2070. And once we have that everywhere, I mean, it's not just not on PC, it's also not on Quest. So even on the platform that would benefit the most from a performance increase, because it's using a Snapdragon mobile chip, Quest 2 and Quest 3 now, they do not have eye tracking yet. And once this happens, once there is eye tracking in every VR headset and every platform, then VR experiences will get so much more impressive visually. And I'm really looking forward to that.
I'm looking forward to seeing the visuals improve. I personally feel, though, that in order for VR to really grow and get more attention, it needs to focus more so on the mechanics, on the input. I think that motion needs to be pushed more in a way so that a non-VR user can see the gameplay, see that it can't be done in flat screen and be enticed to come over. Great visuals are very important, but if we continue to see inputs that do not leverage the unique manner of VR and allow for gameplay opportunities and player expression, that is not possible in flat screen and is only possible in VR. If we don't see devs really leaning into that, then I think VR will continue to struggle to attract an audience, because I believe firmly all VR needs, in terms of gaming at least, all it needs is that one really well-designed game that flat screen players who've never tried VR before will watch someone play and observe how they interact with that in such a human, unique manner that the player is rewarded for, that they would think, oh my God, I want to try that. I could never do anything like that in flat screen. So add that on top of good visuals with things like eye tracking, I think will be the key.
Okay, yeah, maybe. I'm not so sure if really that's what people are waiting for, better inputs. Because what's the point of having amazing inputs if you cannot run the game on your PC, you know? That's the big thing. You need to be able to run the game.
I don't think that having amazing inputs or interesting VR mechanics necessarily needs to have something that's high-end or high fidelity. I just mean the combination of both would be very, very compelling. I would even say that even if you had a relatively low fidelity game, but had really interesting physical, unique inputs that encouraged a form of behavior and results that you couldn't get from flat screen, that would still be extremely compelling to non-VR players, only more so if you pair that with high fidelity.
But there have been a lot of games that tried a ton of different VR input methods. It's just that most of these games are quite small and not known by anyone.
I haven't found them personally. If I use shooters as an example, if you play a shooter game in VR, of course you have the benefit of free aim, and that can be assisted in various ways with virtual stocks. But ultimately, the way that those games are designed, in how the player moves, what actually happens in game, it plays out exactly the same as a flat screen game. If you watch a VR player play a shooter game, a multiplayer shooter, the way that they behave, the way that it looks on screen is very, very close to that of a flat screen game. Character movement is designed the same as a flat screen game, the way the arenas are designed, all the mechanics and blah, blah, blah. There hasn't been a VR game that leans into the complete freedom of motion and the real human side of moving, leveraging things like blind fire, for example, which can't really be done well on flat screen, but could be done very well in VR, and designing your game to encourage you to actually use your body more in a way that looks completely different and new to how a flat screen shooter would play. I think that we haven't seen that attempted, where when you watch someone play this VR shooter, it looks and plays markedly different from a flat screen shooter. Presently, they look fairly similar because of how the design is done. I don't think that there has been a title yet, except for Half-Life Alyx, a little bit, that really, when you watch it, you think that is a VR shooter and that can only be done in VR. I just don't think that there has been the game that's been made to grab the attention and pull in non-VR players to be excited to try those things. You understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah, but I'm not sure, because of course I don't play that many games, so I can't tell you which game does these things. But especially between 2016 and 2018, there were so many games that experimented in every possible way on PC VR with inputs in every way, because devs just loved to experiment with that stuff back then. And most of these games probably have like 10 reviews on Steam and no one knows them. And I'm sure there's probably at least one of them, because there's like 6,000 VR games on Steam or something, that's doing exactly what you want. It's just that no one knows it because, yeah, discoverability and marketing is actually a really big problem for VR devs. We haven't talked about this yet, but that's like such a big topic and problem of the VR market.
Fair enough. Although back then in 2016 to 18 and roundabouts VR again, it was much more niche and less established. I think with it being much more established and accepted in society, now is a good time to strike with getting those kind of titles into the public eye. Whether ones exist already or whether they can be made, I think that VR has grown enough now that if a title is made that really compels, it could be a game changer. And going back to the topic of eye tracking, I completely agree with you. It's wonderful technology. There is another angle, though, which I would consider as someone who is a content creator and streamer of games, is that one disadvantage of eye tracking. It is that if I were to stream a game that used Foveated rendering that took advantage of eye tracking, I would be concerned about the viewer experience, because they would be looking at their entire screens, not focused on one area like I was. And if they're seeing a significantly pixelated outer circumference compared to where I'm looking, that may not make for a very good viewing experience. And streaming one's game, sharing it online, is a very, very big part of the advertising of games now and software in general.
That is indeed a very good point, yeah. I completely agree, that's a big problem. It's hard to fix because, yeah, the performance will be focused on where the player looks. And if you want to record your screen at the same time, the viewer will have a blurry image, mostly. But I think you can be quite optimistic about that only being a problem for a short while, because eventually you will just be able to say, okay, I use eye tracking, I use Foveated rendering, but I want to enable the streamer mode. That just means even the blurry parts are at least 1080p or 1440p, and the stuff you focus on is 8K or something. So you just need to up the minimum a bit to not be super blurry, and most people are fine with making 1080p videos, for example. And then you can probably make good videos still, even while enjoying the benefits of eye tracking and foveated rendering. It just needs to be an option. Like, at the moment, I'm not aware of any game that does this, actually giving a minimum pixel density for content creators. But so far, it's also only something that exists for a short while since the PSVR 2 is out, basically. That's the first mainstream platform that has eye tracking and foveated rendering. So we're just still in the very new phase of this technology.
Yeah, I'm sure that something will eventually come along. Vertigo 2 does a very interesting technique where if you go onto the desktop mirror, to the top right, you can click on a button that lowers all of the rendering within the headset to the lowest, but maintains the highest on the mirror, so that if you are streaming the game using the spectator view, that is an extra render and is smoothed out, they will see the best looking picture, but in the headset you have it on low settings. It's a very, very cool feature.
In some ways, cyubeVR had something similar, but just not exposed in such a way that the user actually knows it exists.
I was looking at the recording of the stream earlier. Do you have some kind of sneaky smoothing going on with the camera on the mirror?
No, you just are very good at smoothly moving your head.
I didn't know I was that good. I sometimes the games seem a lot more jittery, but yeah, it was surprisingly smooth. I guess I am that good. Thank you.
But you could also have noticed something else on the mirror of cyubeVR.
Oh, you can put me on the spot now. What detail have I failed to notice?
Well, there actually is a bit of foveated rendering going on in cyubeVR. So the edges of your stream actually look pixelated.
I see. I didn't know that. I didn't notice at all, which is the point of it.
Roughly like 5% of GPU performance or so. It's just a minor thing. It's only foveated rendering for one small feature, basically, but still something that saves 5% of GPU performance, so still quite nice. So that's, for example, one of those engine changes I did, where I edited the shader code of the Unreal Engine stuff to be more suited for VR, because these 5% are worth saving, I think.
I agree.
And so when I update to UE5, that will be one of these things that are a pain to make working again. But UE5 actually has real support for foveated rendering for a lot of features. So from that perspective, I will actually gain quite a bit of performance when I enable the fixed foveated rendering that UE5 supports. It's not eye-tracked, because almost no PC VR headsets have eye tracking. And the implementation of the foveated rendering on the GPU, on the low level, is just not as great as on PSVR 2. But still will probably give a benefit of like 10% and not just 5%. But for the real benefit, we will need to move to actually GPUs that really support foveated rendering for VR natively.
And do you think that we will get there?
Oh yeah, I'm sure we will get there. It's a question of when, not a question of if. But the when is probably when a large percentage of the people who buy a new GPU care about this feature. Or when other influential players on the market will go to NVIDIA and AMD and say, hey, I need this. I want to release this amazing new VR headset. I want to make the best AAA game. I need this feature. I need really good foveated rendering, eye tracking. Please add this. You know, if like EA and Ubisoft together form a coalition and go to NVIDIA and AMD and say that because they want to make so many amazing AAA VR games on PC, then AMD and NVIDIA might do something.
Keep dreaming, Master Stone. Keep dreaming.
Yeah. But it's really good that on PSVR 2 we are there now. They have actually spent the time, like Sony and AMD, to really optimize this hardware, the GPU in there, for foveated rendering for VR. They've done some really cool stuff that just doesn't exist on PC, and that makes it really work well. And so if Sony can put effort into that, then other platform owners can too. And they considered it important enough for even the limited amount of PS5 gamers that would buy a PSVR 2, which is hopefully still a lot.
Agreed. It's a very big thing that Sony considered it a worthwhile investment to bring out the PSVR 2 and do the titles. It's a very big step. So with a big company like that, with eye tracking, yes.
Because it's actually like not even Meta cared about putting eye tracking into their Quest 3. They just ignored it because they thought it's not important. And the PSVR 2 is not really much more expensive than a Quest 3. A bit more expensive.
I think maybe it's about £500.
Yeah, I don't know, especially don't know the pounds.
Huh. It's about the same as Euro. The conversion is really similar.
Yeah, and both Sony and Meta can basically subsidize their headsets in the same way because they get money from every game that's sold on their platform. So I really think Meta should have added eye tracking to the Quest 3. That's unfortunately like a wasted 1 to 2 years of VR progress.
Yes, Meta and VR, indeed. They are a company. They are a company doing things. There would be a lot to say about them. I think you can ascertain that I'm not really a fan. They've done some good things, but I don't think that they've done well for the industry, all in all, and they've held things back. I don't know if you'll be willing to express your opinion on them, but yeah, I'm not a fan. Not that I think the Quest is a bad device. Actually, I think it's very good, and the Quest 3 is something I would like to get my hands on eventually. It does do plenty of things right, but the overall attitude and direction of the company, I think it's doing more harm than good in the long term. I always think about the long term. The short term, okay, fine, but the long term, not so good.
I think I would probably disagree about that and say in the long term, it doesn't matter what anyone is doing now. In the long term, VR will be super amazing on all platforms and everyone will have a VR headset.
Interesting. No, I wouldn't. Yeah, I would disagree. I think that the long term is affected by the now. So I think the now is very important and inextricably connected to the long term.
It is connected, but when new technologies get introduced, then some technologies are just inevitable. It's not about if the first company that does it is good or if the second company that does it is good or the third or the fourth. It just matters if the technology is something that people want, and if it's something that they want, then at some point there will be someone who makes it in an amazing way that will become mainstream.
But would that technology emerge inevitably if the now, or the short-term immediate now, did not create the conditions for the longer term? The longer term needs the conditions created from the now, and if the now doesn't create those or successfully create them, then the longer term may not exist, may not be inevitable.
But why would it not exist?
I don't know. Maybe the industry just doesn't take off as one would hope, even though we know that's not the case. We know that it's here to stay. But hypothetically, if it didn't gain the traction or momentum in the interest or technology that those who may, in the long term, have built something amazing do not go ahead and do so because the momentum now was not gained.
I think momentum in the beginning is relevant for short-term progress, but not for long-term progress. Long-term, everything that works will be done. Like, if the technology allows for it, and if it's something that humans want, it will happen.
I see where you're coming from here. Okay, so you're basically saying that there are certain things that will be inevitable no matter what, and those things to you are quite apparent.
Yeah, I think it happened with a lot of technology in the past, not related to VR, but I don't know exact examples at the moment. But I mean, there were electric vehicles 100 years ago. They didn't take off. And now everyone's making electric vehicles. And it might have happened a few years earlier or a few years later if some company hadn't existed. But in the end, every vehicle will be electric because it's just the technology where the energy you produce is used and converted into velocity with the least losses and the cheapest. So the technology will win. And VR is just amazing once you use it. You put on the headset, you use the controllers, you are in the game. Everyone will say that playing through a game like Half-Life Alyx is so much more immersive in VR compared to not doing it in VR. Everyone would say this story had so much more impact in VR than outside of VR. And everyone would say, okay, if there's a similar game again, I want to play it in VR. I do not want to play Half-Life Alyx 2 in flat. No one would want to do that, I think. And when a technology is so clearly the winner for certain types of games, everyone will want to use it at some point.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that you and I can definitely agree on, is that the technology of VR itself, even though it may not be where we want it to be, it's very clearly a winner. It's very clearly the future that we know people are going to adopt as the norm eventually, right?
Yeah, there might be a few genres where it just doesn't work. Like, I'm not sure yet if something like a Command & Conquer can be much better in VR than outside of VR. RTS that really are about not getting immersed, but being super fast and competitive and playing the game and just having an overview and doing stuff like what you do in an RTS, Age of Empires and stuff, games like that. They might just work better outside of VR. But for the majority of games, I think VR is just so much superior that, they will end up in VR.
Yeah. And not even just for games. I've always contested that VR will change how we do many things in society. Our education, our communication, so many things. And games will only be a small part of that, or a reasonably big part of that.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Apple is trying to do now with the Vision Pro, right? They immediately try to go for the non-gaming part and hope that that convinces people more to buy a VR headset. And I think that's a fine choice. I mean, as I said, I don't usually buy Apple products, but it's fine to have Apple as a company that is just doing things differently than everyone else, and maybe they can get VR to be mainstream that way. Who knows? And then people will also get into gaming that way. They won't just stay at doing video conferences and watching movie in their home. they will eventually notice, oh wow, you know, playing a game in VR is really cool. Much better than playing on a TV or a phone. And so sooner or later, VR gaming will take off and become really mainstream.
Very much agreed. And that's been the premise of my channel since the very start, knowing that that will happen and wanting to spread the good word of VR. Even though I veered more into sort of preaching to the choir, as most VR channels do, it seems, as you would say, inevitable. But I do hope to get back on the track of trying to communicate with a non-VR audience at the same time to try and explain to them, you do not know what this is until you try it, because that's another big thing for VR too. It's like if I were to say to you, describe a color you've never seen before, you just can't do it. And the same principle is true for VR. But I don't see any other channels, actually, or any other media that tries to elaborate on how revolutionary an experience VR is to someone who has never experienced it before. So that was my goal, to fill that gap, and I haven't done it very well in the recent year. But yeah, I don't even know why I'm saying this anymore.
Hard to explain to people without trying VR how it is to try VR.
Yeah, which is why I wanted to lean on the aspect of you do not understand this. What you are seeing here is not what you think it is, and really hammer home the point that you do not know until you try, which is a message I don't really feel is being shared enough by other VR media content creators. Understandably so, because, you know, you're preaching to the choir most of the time, but I think the non-VR audience needs an extra bit of help in understanding that what they see on the monitor is just nowhere near the experience or comparable to what actually happens in a headset.
Yeah, the more you can tell that to people, the better. Some YouTubers somehow try to reach and manage to reach a lot of people who are not in VR yet and make them watch VR content, but I don't know how they do that. Like Haby, for example. Somehow he gets millions of views on every video about PSVR games, and most of his viewers do not even have a VR headset because they just didn't get into VR yet, but somehow millions of people watch it.
How do you know that most of his viewers don't have headsets?
Well, as you might know, he made a video about cyubeVR around 2.5 years ago, and that video was super important for cyubeVR because like probably half the people who play cyubeVR now found it through his video. So that he definitely reaches a lot of people who have a VR headset. But because I was of course very interested in his video and what people think about the game and his video in general, I of course read all the comments below his video, and that was like thousands of comments, I think. And most of them were, wow, this looks amazing, I wish I had VR.
Okay, so there is a significant percentage who comment, at least, who do not have VR.
But even the small percentage who has VR still made a large impact in the CubeVR community. It was like I wake up and look at the CubeVR Discord and, oh wow, 200 new people joined. And normally it's like one a day. So
I'm mixed in that I'm very happy that Habi does this for VR and for devs like yourself. I'm also jealous that I can't do that. But I'm also accepting that my approach is far more niche compared to his, and so that I will never have that kind of reach. But I wish that I could have that kind of effect for the software that I highlight too. And if I can get to even a fraction of that in my short time doing this online thing, then I'll be happy with that.
Yeah, and I don't know how he managed to do it. He somehow just has a super good understanding of the YouTube algorithm or makes videos that people absolutely love.
Yeah, for me, I feel that his approach and his attitude is very resonant with the overall personality and psychology of those who frequent YouTube often in that space. Captures the kind of younger audience, and he has that sort of, that charming, I'm bumbling through things, I don't really know what I'm doing, approach and attitude, whilst also capitalizing on memes, and it's hard for me to put into words, but I understand very much why and how he gets the views and attention that he does, and he does a good job. He caters very well to the expected audience that one would have on the platform.
Yeah, and he's doing it in a way that is natural, and he actually shows what he likes, which isn't what every VR YouTuber does. Like, I mean, he was the first big VR YouTuber, really big, who made a video about CubeVR. And that was always something that made me a bit sad, that I make this super beautiful game and no one on YouTube or any other media actually seems to care. I always felt like, okay, it looks amazing and it feels amazing, so why can't you maybe just mention it at least once? So I had to wait like 3 years for someone to mention it, Haby, and well, I'm super grateful that he actually did that. But I wish there would be more VR YouTubers who mentioned CubeVR. You did a review video, Haby did his video. I think there's like 1 or 2 other review videos of CubeVR on YouTube.
There are
But
quite a
like-
few, but they haven't had a big reach.
I mean, actually review videos that try to not just I play the game for 10 minutes, but
Oh, okay.
I have played the game for a while and now I tell you why it's good or why it's bad.
Hmm.
And videos of that type, I think there are 3 or 4 in total. And that's not much for a game that's been out for almost 6 years. So there is a big missing thing there. I not quite know the right word, but a big
There is a big
Gap.
attention gap.
a big gap of what people should do to make good VR games known. That does not seem to happen because there are just too few VR YouTubers and too few VR websites. Not just YouTubers, it's like also on websites and blogs and whatever. But somehow a lot of VR gamers, I mean, if you ask the average PC VR gamer, which games do you play? They will say, okay, I bought the headset because of Beat Saber or Half-Life Alyx. And then I got Blade and Sorcery. That was good. And then I got H3 VR. That was good. And Boneworks. But then no new games existed anymore. And that's why I stopped playing VR. And they don't even know what other VR games exist. And I think that is a really big problem of VR. That there are not enough VR influencers who actually tell people there are games. Like, there are not thousands of awesome VR games maybe, but there are hundreds of awesome VR games. And all these people who say there are not enough VR games have not played hundreds of the good VR games. They've just played the top 3 or 5 or 10. And somehow there is this big gap of the awesome VR games that exist. And many of them sitting on Steam with 10 reviews or 100. And all the gamers who say there are not enough VR games. I mean, what's your opinion on that?
When VR gamers say that there are not enough VR games, I don't think that they're communicating exactly that. I think what they're actually expressing is there are not enough innovative or interesting, unique games to draw them in that are uniquely doing VR things, or enough of it. Not that there aren't okay ones or good ones. I've played all the ones that you've mentioned too, and I'm actually not a fan of some of the ones which are more popular. I don't care for Beat Saber, Blade and Sorcery. I appreciate its attempt, but I think its execution ultimately misses the mark. I'm not sure. It's a complex topic and I would need to think on it more. And I'm hyper aware of my limitation and my own bias, and I can't speak for the wider audience. And also I know that I don't tend to fit into the wider audience with how I process and judge things and approach things. So I don't know. I would need to think about it more. In regards to VR content creators though, you've reminded me that I was going to mention something that I forgot, is that I think the online VR community has a very, very, very nasty habit of propping up and praising mediocrity, saying that something incredibly average and mediocre is amazing, or it is the VR version of this popular flat screen game, and they do this for attention, for clicks, all the stuff that keeps them relevant. But I think that has a knock-on effect of any curious onlookers will see the mediocrity, or VR players who they will see the videos that praise mediocrity as being something very good, and then they try it themselves, and then they're like, okay, it's okay. And then that eventually has a compounding effect over time, and maybe they don't consciously notice the interest waning. But I know I'm very scatterbrained there, but I'll lock on to the point in regards to content creators, is that I feel that most of the content creators that I'm aware of, whilst they can do decent contributions, they have a nasty habit of propping up very mediocre products as if they are something more than that, and it is not helping the subconscious impression and interest in VR.
Does that actually happen often?
I really can't say, Master Stone. I would not be able to have any confidence in saying how often it does or doesn't happen. I only know what I know and what I see, but I think it happens often enough to be significant. It's mentioned in comments. It's mentioned to me often. Now, my audience is going to be biased towards my way of thinking, of course. That's what happens with being a content creator. But I keep a close eye on new releases, and I will often try them if I can afford to. That's another factor as well that one has to consider, is that, yes, there are many games out there, but we have to buy them, and we all don't have that much cash, or at least I don't. Yeah, I think there's a subconscious cognitive dissonance that's happening here that is very much there, but as I said, it's subconscious. So I think that people will watch these reviews and they will experience deep down there is a disconnect, I think.
Okay, but the bigger problem probably still is that most people just don't cover VR at all, right?
What's there to cover though?
Well, games like Half-Life Alyx or other games.
Well, that's been fairly covered though, right? Half-Life Alyx is very well known, even to flat-screen gamers. It's critically acclaimed. It's very, very well known.
Well, actually, I think if I look at like the German landscape, for example, there's like this one big Let's Player who made Let's Plays popular in Germany, Gronk. I don't know if it's still the biggest one, probably not, but 10 years ago he was the biggest. And when Half-Life Alyx came out, he bought a VR headset, and maybe he had it already, and started playing Half-Life Alyx, of course, because, normally doesn't play VR games, but plays Half-Life Alyx. But then in the middle of the game, he got a bit ill or something, and that's why he couldn't continue playing VR for a bit, but then he never continued, because it just wasn't relevant enough for him to keep playing this VR game that he enjoyed much to that point. He just went back to other flat games.
Well, there will no doubt be other factors involved there. As a content creator, he would have felt pressure to move on to the next thing immediately and not linger on it too much, right? Especially if he was extremely popular. To keep his relevance and content up, he would be less likely to stick on something for as long as he would if he were a regular player.
Yeah, but if even Half-Life Alyx cannot get a big mainstream Let's Player to finish a Let's Play of the game, then what game should be able to do that?
Well, if he was motion sick, if he became ill, then...
No, that wasn't the problem. He actually enjoyed the game, could play it fine.
So you're saying that he just played the once, and then he never came back to it?
Well, he played it once and only half of it. Never finished the Let's Play, which is always like something that Let's Players usually don't want to do, because if you start watching a series on their channel, can expect that you can watch the game from start to finish. If it's a Let's Player that usually plays games from start to finish. I watched his Let's Play back then because I like listening to him, and he played a big VR game, and I was really interested in what a mainstream Let's Player says about this awesome VR game that just came out. And I really enjoyed watching his playthrough through Half-Life Alyx until it just stopped.
I really don't know.
And I also know that like the big mainstream gaming press in Germany almost never covers VR. VR is just something that does not really exist.
That's true for everywhere, I found. The mainstream, VR will not enter the mainstream until it crosses a certain threshold, and the mainstream are based upon a very entrenched traditional cycle, and they rely on upholding that pattern of habits and behavior and things which are already well established. So until VR breaks more ground, we will not see it acknowledged by the mainstream much. It will get there eventually, but the mainstream are another topic because they're almost their own ecosystem, quite separate from the viewers and players. It's a parasitic relationship where they rely on various factors in order to keep themselves going and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
I can only speak for myself, but there is a chronic lack of inspired software to inspire me as a content creator, and it could be my unique problem where I can't function without that inspiration. But games like Cube and Compound and Alyx, which I didn't make a review on, it was too late. They are inspired games which ooze a level of care and quality and uniqueness and joy for being a VR game that inspires me as a creator to want to share that. I feel as a creator and as a consumer that those kind of titles are lacking, or I can barely find them. And so when I sit down to think, what can I make? What can I share? I'm often not sure.
How do you usually find your VR games? Like, how did you find out about the existence of cyubeVR?
I was just trawling through the Steam store page quite vigorously. Back then, I had only recently got into VR proper. I'd tried it and had been aware of it for a long time, and I was trawling through experiences, clicking on all of them, most of them, except for the really obviously bad ones. And I tried cyubeVR because I normally don't play those kind of games, but it's in VR. So I thought to myself, well, if it's in VR, then how different is that going to make an experience I normally wouldn't care for? And that's why I tried it. The screenshots were also beautiful, but that wasn't a big factor for me. It was mainly just wanting to try new things, and I just found it randomly in one of the categories of the store page.
Okay. Did you actually look through like 200 pages of VR games, or only like the top 20?
I went through as many as I could.
Was there thousands of games or just hundreds?
Just hundreds, because once you cross a certain threshold with Steam at least, depending on the category, it will start to copy the same games again. So it allows you to scroll, but it just keeps showing you the same games over and over again, eventually just in a different order.
Yeah, and that is a problem. Like, discoverability on Steam for VR games is not good. And I think it would help VR a lot if Valve would put a bit more effort into that, because you need to match good VR games with VR gamers. In theory, there are millions of people who actually have PC VR headset and a good enough PC. There have been millions of headsets sold, but matching the good games that exist with the gamers that have the hardware does not really work. It just fails. Steam only shows you the top sellers, and the top sellers are usually the games that were just released, because the really good games from 5 years ago are not in the top sellers anymore, but might be the best games. And people don't find them because they also don't go to YouTube and watch videos of 5 years old games back when they were released, and YouTubers don't make videos on 5 years old games usually. So yeah, there's really a big discoverability issue of the many good VR games that have been done.
As a consumer, it's also a bit of a risk. If I were to be scrolling through the categories and I were to see a game of interest, a VR game of interest that was 5 years old and maybe still was in early access and looked interesting, and it's still a risk on my end because I would consider the factor, well, number one, it's 5 years old, so how janky could it be? Number two, is it early access? Is it unfinished? I don't know. It's quite common for VR games to be quite shallow and or unfinished. Considering that with financial reasons, shall I take the risk on trying that game? There are a lot of factors against me as a consumer, especially when we think about VR games that are several years old. It was still very much in the janky phase, which we have gotten over a lot of that stuff now, and the idea of having to play through jankily implemented things that we know can be done so much better for a product that may or may not be properly finished or be missing key features.
But usually, I would say a game that's 5 years old is much less likely to be janky than a game that was just released.
Could you elaborate?
Well, if a game was released 5 years ago and it has a reasonable amount of buyers, then the devs will have released a lot of updates since then. Even if maybe just in the first year after release that fixed all problems that people had, if it has good reviews. And so you're very unlikely to find jank in these old games that have been polished to the state where the devs thought, okay, putting more work into it makes no sense because it's good enough. While new games are often always janky when they come out.
I see your point.
So I think people should actually play more of these 5-6 year old VR games that are really good by now, like cyubeVR.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I can concede your points there. When I say janky, I suppose I should elaborate and say that there would be integration of mechanics that may be more archaic, like how you would grip things and your ability to move and interact may be more limited or maybe less refined than something that we would get in recent years. And what would justify me tolerating that? What would that game give me, story-wise, setting-wise, to tolerate the implementation of those things that may not be so nice? Like, there's a game that I played recently called Organ Quarter. I live-streamed that. It's based upon Silent Hill and Resident Evil 1, and it had a few archaic ways of interacting that I tolerated because the setting was interesting enough, but I was really let down by the game all in all because it had zero plot and zero story, and just that kind of setting absolutely needs one. So it was a massive downer in the end. It started off well. I regret buying that.
What was the Steam review percentage? Do you still know that?
Have a look now, one moment. It was quite good. It was reasonably well received, I think. So, very positive. 272 reviews total. It was released in 2017. And it was actually updated earlier this year. Yeah, so it was reasonably well received.
What's the exact review percentage?
It's 89%.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, the presentation was good. It tried in certain areas, but God, yeah, just having zero plot and zero story and just randomly taking you through these areas. And it did a few interesting things, but it didn't do anywhere near enough. If I would have played this back in the day, I probably would have been more lenient on it. And that's what I mean as someone coming at it from the present day. It's always a bit more of a risk.
But you have the assumption that a game coming out in 2023 will do things automatically better than a game coming out in 2017. But why? I think devs back then could make the same good game like they can now. And there's no reason to assume that they will be more likely to do the good one now.
There is the assumption that their grasp on how VR interactions work would be better when released in the present day.
Yeah, but then we're back to the topic of that VR devs play few VR games, and so there probably is not much of a difference.
You do make a good point, and it is something I'm willing to concede on, and when I look in the future, I will consider your words more. Though I still think I have some valid trepidation with it, but you do make a good point, and I will concede there.
And when it comes to this aspect you mentioned of, well, you don't want to waste money on games, and many people think like that, I always think, why do not more people make use of the refund system of Steam? Like, you can buy any game, play it for 2 hours, and refund it if you don't like it. So there is no financial risk in buying a game, just because you might not be sure if you like it. There just is a time investment risk. You might waste your time playing a bad game, but the money you can always get back if you decide within 2 hours that you don't like it.
That's an easy one to answer, only for myself. I can't speak for others. It's the psychological hit. Because when you purchase a game, you purchase it with hope. especially in today's climate. For me, when I look at purchasing a VR game, knowing that the climate is not being utilized as well as it could be, and I'm hoping for things to improve, when I make a purchase, I purchase with hope that I'm going to get a decent experience that gets VR. And because I feel that that's lacking a lot, then if I purchase a game and it's just yet another misses the mark, it's very demoralizing for me, and it puts me off the industry. When I play a bad game, it makes me stop wanting to make content for a while. It genuinely does. It genuinely gets me down.
Okay.
So there is the psychological hit there, wanting to keep my own spirits up.
But if it's like very positive on Steam, then can't be super bad. Like
I don't trust Steam reviews for the most part now. If something is very positive, then it means that there is a level of quality to the game that I can assume. Presentation-wise, it's there. But it's clear that my typical standards tends to be above that of your average reviewer or commenter. So I don't really take those into much account. They are a very minimal effect.
But that's always something that might be relevant to mention. Like, if you're a VR gamer and you want PC VR games to do well, then please actually remember to give it a review on Steam. Because devs need that. Devs need this feedback for themselves, that people enjoy the games, and for the Steam algorithm to actually show the game to more people. And if people don't write reviews, then there's no way to know for other people if games are good or not good.
I think I said it to you before. I don't think the average consumer understands the importance of the reviews, and that it's up to devs to really put it front and center how important they are and try to push that as much as possible. I really firmly believe the average user does not know how much of an impact reviews have on the discoverability, so devs need to inform consumers more. From my perspective, whenever I see a company or dev or even a content creator telling me to like or review or do those things, I understand it helps them a little bit, but it only feels like it's a little bit. If it was stressed more how vitally important it is, then it may be more effectual and less invasive ways like the pop-ups, of course.
Yeah, but maybe there's also something that content creators could tell people more about it. Hey, if you really like a game, like this one, which is really good, blah, 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 whichever one you're talking about, just remember to give it a review and make sure that more people see that this game is really good so that the devs can make more of this.
Absolutely. Completely agree with that, and that's something that I've failed to do with pretty much all of my good reviews, so that's very much noted, and I will do that in the future. I do plan on eventually making a list of exceptional, interesting VR experiences of which your game would naturally be a part of that. I just don't feel that there is enough collectively to justify that yet. I don't know if I'm correct or not. It's an instinctual thing. I need to go back and look through the games that I thought were exceptional and really did something interesting with VR. And when I say interesting, I mean my standard of interesting may be very different to another person's standard, but I mean really, really does something with VR that is unique and special and only possible with VR. And those that I've found are few and far between presently, or there is a bit of nuance in it. Like Alex. Alex doesn't necessarily do anything in VR that you couldn't do in flat screen, I think. All the interactions with the stuff on the shelves you could abstract in flat screen, but it's just how it's so naturally done that makes it an exception. And yeah.
Usually these type of videos seem to do well on YouTube, like top 10 VR games to buy in 2023.
They do. The list
so people
videos
are interested
do well
in these videos, but people also always mention the same 10 games every time, and
yep, exactly.
That doesn't really help much.
Yeah, and I'm very aware of that. So I don't want to be redundant there. I don't want to be repeating the same thing, and that's why when I do make those videos, I want to actually have some genuinely unique and interesting ones which are not a part of the crowd.
Yeah, that's good.
But the consequence of that means because I'm not producing all the time, then I remain a smaller content creator because I don't follow the crowd. Much like you remain fairly obscure for the same reason, because you haven't followed the meta crowd and compromised and all of that stuff. It is the curse of not following the crowd and sticking to one's principles and having standards and quality, it seems, Master Stone.
Yeah, that seems to be the case, yeah.
It's the price that we must pay.
But it would also benefit everyone if you, for example, had a bigger reach to make more people aware of actually good VR games, you know?
It would, but then the algorithm responds to what we want, right? So you say it could be a benefit, but the audience ultimately determines the condition of things. So they seem to be happy with what they've got now, and I serve my niche audience and you serve your niche. And if the broader audience changes more to prefer our niche of things, then we'll see the benefit naturally, unless there's some kind of manipulation going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've tried to reconcile this for a while. It can be a little bit easy to get bitter and annoyed and frustrated, and you can be told, like I'm sure you've been told many times, that your game is very high quality and offers a unique experience, and you think, well, if that's the case, why don't more people know? Why aren't more people coming? And yeah, of course. And I get a similar thing with my channel. I speak to another dev, and he said to me privately that he wishes that I was in charge of the industry, and that he's very upset that I don't have millions of views and with the topics I talk about, and I get similar sentiments through some of the comments and supporters, and so it's easy to turn around and think, well, if that's the case, if that's true, then why am I not getting more support? But yeah, when we diverge from the easy crowd, we pay the consequences for that.
Yeah, and for devs, it's a bit different because for them, it's really also a matter of marketing. Like YouTubers don't really have to do marketing. You just somehow have to hit the algorithm and mainstream appeal. But devs need to think about marketing, and indie devs completely suck at marketing usually. It's the least favorite thing of every dev to do. Every dev who likes to work on games and not spend time trying to tell people how awesome your game is. So yeah, that's the difference between the challenge of YouTubers and the challenge of devs. Devs in theory have it in their hand if they had a big marketing budget, like AAA devs, but they just don't. And yeah, then it's hard.
We don't search for ourselves as users anymore either. We don't actively go and search marketplaces or look to serve our own needs and preferences. We go online, we enter an environment, and we expect to have something thrust in front of our faces. We as users are quite complacent and are just ready to be served up whatever's in front of us most of the time, and that's enough. And that can lead to obscurity of otherwise quality products or creators too.
Yeah, because there often is just a lot of stuff, and finding the good stuff is too hard. So you get drowned in the mediocre and not so good stuff, and then sometimes maybe find one good thing.
And it's very overwhelming to be a user in general these days, particularly as a gamer, because you have to factor in so many things now. You have to, when you're looking to experience something, it's, especially for VR, it's often the case that it may be early access or unfinished, and then the onus or burden is placed upon you to keep track of the updates for that product, what other people are saying about it, whether you should take the time, effort, and energy to provide feedback free of charge without any recompense to the creators of said product, not knowing whether it will ever be seen or acknowledged or even cared about, and then keeping up with different kinds of forums and the conversations happening there, and if you have a discussion with someone and whether the consensus agrees with you or not. You have to do so much homework and managing as a user now just to keep up. It is very overwhelming now. It's very tiresome.
Yeah, and in theory, algorithms could do that stuff if they were well designed.
When you say well designed, what do you mean?
Well, Steam could create an algorithm that really looks at, okay, which games are people playing and reviewing well, which games seem to be of really high quality, and which games should we recommend.
How would they determine the high quality, though, especially if we were to agree that people are praising mediocrity? How would the algorithm be able to actually determine what is truly high quality, especially if there's a disconnect between player standards and actual high quality, if we're assuming that?
On Steam, the standards are quite high. It's quite easy for a game to get a bad review score. So if a game has like 95%, it's really hard for a game to get to 95% review. So I think if you go into the VR category, Steam should show you a list of all the games with like 95% positive. Unfortunately, cyubeVR only has 92%, so it wouldn't be in that list yet. But there are quite a few games, like over 100, I think, VR games that have 95% positive, where almost everyone who plays it says it's an amazing game. And these games should be the games that you see when you go into the VR category. But instead, what you see is the top sellers, the games that have made the most revenue in the past 24 hours. That's what you see, and that is not in any way a result of quality. That's just the games that have put the most into marketing in the past 24 hours, basically. Yeah, so that doesn't help much to promote quality.
Agreed, yeah. I'm looking at the top sellers as we speak. We've got Phasmophobia, The Forest, Microsoft Flight Simulator F123, X-Universe Anniversary Edition, which is £250 because one of their games is a VR version which was not well received. Fallout 4, racing games, Ghost of Tabor, VR. Yeah. Looking through this now, it's not good. I agree.
Yeah, there actually is this one other website, like steam250.com or something, where you can go to the VR-only category, or VR supported, and see the top 150 games sorted by reviews.
What's it called? Steam250?
Yeah, steam250.com.
Okay, so this will just give you a list of the
a list of the games, not just sorted by reviews, but also by sales. So I mean, sorted by how many reviews they have. So the top is the games with the most reviews. Like it's 50-50. You need to have the score is calculated as like multiplying the amount of reviews by the score of the reviews or something. So a game that's at the top is most likely to be very popular and very highly rated. But a game can appear in the top 100 even if only very few people bought it, if it's like 100% positive. And this list is probably what everyone should look at when they get into VR. Play these top 150 or top 100 of the most reviewed, most played VR games and not look at the top sellers of whatever is popular in the last 24 hours. But no one knows about such lists and no one promotes them, and yeah.
And it really doesn't help as well that algorithms will keep on feeding you the same preferences over and over again. So it keeps you in a bubble, a feedback loop of all the same kinds of stuff. It doesn't give you the chance to see things outside of your comfort zone either. Right. Well, that's everything that I have in mind to ask. So then, Master Stone, thank you very, very much for joining me. It's been lovely speaking with you again. Very interesting too.
Yeah, I agree. It was great chat. Maybe we should do it again in a year and see what changed. Or 2 years.
I'll be happy to.